Chen Beiming was young and successful, until one day he was betrayed by his friends and robbed of his life. A voice from outside reminded him that he had a duty to protect his home. It was his sister's voice. She was surprised that his brother thought he was dead. Chen Beiming realized that to get revenge, he must wreak havoc and repay all those who betrayed him, because he realized that the time had come for him to become king himself. The loud voice of his sister awakened Chen Beiming. The girl was frightened and hopefully believed that her brother could protect their home. Before he could recover from his sleep, the young man wondered where he was. When she heard her brother's voice, she immediately rejoiced. Now faith did not leave her heart. Chen Beiming couldn't believe that he was alive. He only looked up in confusion, trying to realize what had happened to him. His musings were interrupted by the boy's threats that reminded him of countless debts. Suddenly, there was a loud, frightened voice of a girl trying to protect her brother. She begged me not to burn down their house. At a loss, Chen Beiming only remembered one name. It was Shuer's name. He didn't understand why he was in his home that he had left 10 years ago, just as he didn't understand what was happening to him. Only images from the past flashed before his eyes, drowning out the pain he seemed to feel. Chen Beiming recalled the events on the Green Mountain when the 5 heavenly union lords betrayed him the moment he caught the spirit fox in the superiority stage. The young man clenched his fists in resentment because he had done so much for the Heavenly Alliance, and they betrayed him because of the threat to their own position. Now Chen Beiming realized that their fears were destined to come true, as well as realizing that he was in the city of Luone 10 years ago because Shuer was still alive. The guys standing at the door of the house continued to make threats. Now they switched to the boy's sister, promising to sell her on the black market. A flash of rage blinded Chen Beiming, and he promised to kill the offenders if they didn't stop their bullying. Ignoring the guy's words, the bandits continued to demand back the money that had been taken by his family. Recalling the events of the past, Chen Beiming promised to return the sum of 3 million in 3 days if those brought the receipt. There was a pause, for the boys did not understand how the young man knew about the exact amount of money in question. Frantically going through and counting the receipts, the bandits were shocked that this was exactly how much the debt was. Chen Beiming replayed the events of the past in his mind and realized that things were completely different back then. The chief bandit continued to insist that the young man would not be able to get the sum within 3 days. In bits and pieces, remembering the past, Chen Beiming spoke out a name. It was Dongfang Zu. She was the second daughter of the Dongfang family and the sister of the girl to whom the young man was betrothed before the death of his parents. Hearing the familiar name, the bandits were stunned. The Beiming family's duty was now a mere formality. They started to make excuses and say they didn't know anything until the girl's voice interrupted them. Dongfang Zu ordered Chen Beiming to get out of the city, and then his debts would be paid. She said that his house was of no value because the family had no money to cover even part of the debt. The little sister's pitiful voice was heard begging not to sell their house. Chen Beiming calmed the little girl down and promised that no one would be able to bully her as long as he was alive. Mad with rage, the brother ordered Dongfang Zu to immediately remove himself. Instead of the expected departure, the girl immediately started yelling in response to the young man's rudeness. That's when she ordered the bandits to come back in 3 days to get their money back. Unquestioningly obeying her words, the boys promised to do her bidding. Now they realized that they had the last word, leaving the Beiming family home. Walking away, Dongfang Zu continued to wonder where the guy would get the money to pay his debt from without expecting rude words in return. To which Chen Beiming only said that the matter did not concern her. Enraged, she left the house, claiming that the young man had gone mad. Rejoiced by the departure of the unpleasant person, the sister began to prepare dinner because her brother came to his senses after several days of uninterrupted sleep. Chen Beiming looked lovingly at the little girl who was tending to her chores, as suddenly a white, fluffy lump landed on his shoulder. Now the young man did not hide his delight and joy. It was Snowball. Holding Snowball in his arms, he didn't realize how he'd gotten back to his original condition. But he clearly understood that his savior was with him now because Fluffy had the ability to travel through time. His musings were interrupted by Shuya's voice, who assumed that the lump was a battle spirit. She was surprised that her brother had become a hunter. Justifying himself, Beiming introduced his friend and suggested that the girl play with him when she was sad. There seemed to be no limit to the child's happiness, and her eyes shone so brightly. In turn, Snowball sniffed at the girl's shoulder, anticipating a strong friendship. As a joke, Chen Beiming warned the beast to behave himself with his new girlfriend. After making sure everyone was happy, the young man left the room, thinking about his plans for the future. Chen Beiming recalled the events of the past while climbing the stairs. He realized that he had to do things differently now. He remembered the materials his parents had left behind and wondered if they would be enough to create a new weapon. The room was in chaos. Beiming thought frustratingly that he would have to make an effort to find what he was looking for. Something gleamed in the far box. It was an inlaid dagger. The young man's happiness was boundless, for now he could use the find to hunt demons outside the city. The boy's joy was interrupted by a voice from the first floor calling for Shui and Beiming. That voice was familiar to him. Wu Gaoxian is here. Shuer ran out to greet the unexpected guest, who had come to deliver good news for her brother. Seeing beaming Wu Gaoxian invited him outside to show him what he came for. In indignation, the guy assumed that the friend had come again for help with his work. Before he knew it, Wu Gaoxian was dragging beaming out of the house, promising a great opportunity to make some money, and on the way, swearing to Shuer that he would bring her brother home soon, not forgetting to remind the girl to be careful. She only stood bewildered on the porch and wished the boys to take care of themselves. The boys ran through the forest and seemed to notice nothing in their path. On the move, beaming tried to figure out what his friend was up to this time. Finally stopping, Wu Gaoxian asked his comrade if he had heard anything about the soaring tree kite. The young man was immediately confused and disbelieving that someone was finally able to take the life of an unknown creature. Then a friend told him that a monster had attacked several families and now they were gathering hunters to deal with it. But the guy's emotional story was interrupted. Chen Beiming realized that this was not the best time to hunt a beast. Wu Gaoxian continued to insist that the idea was promising because each part of the beast was worth a fortune. Deciding to agree with his friend, Beiming asked where the beast was. So the guy rushed north to make sure he didn't miss out on the bounty. A surprised Wu Gaoxian shouted after him, clearly not expecting such a violent reaction from his friend. Somewhere in the distance, a battle was going on. Through the turmoil, someone warned his comrades of the danger of the poison of the tree serpent. One of the fighters desperately threw himself and his sword at the serpent, hoping to win. Already later, he realized that this was his end, because in battle there is no place for emotions, only cold calculation is important. Wanting to help their comrade, the fighters, one by one, tried to resist the monster. But the beastess was ready to tackle the hunters with just one swipe of her huge tail. Without stopping the fight, the guys helped the wounded and dragged them aside, so that they could have a chance to save themselves. A guy removed from the battlefield begged his comrade not to leave him. Death was somewhere very near. Rising above their heads, the serpent continued to confront the hunters. It hissed and spat venom. Someone in the crowd, horror-stricken and battle-weary, shouted that the beast was mad. The enraged monster tore down, hit the ground, and immediately disappeared. One of the fighters miraculously managed to survive because the beast was demonically strong. A voice from the crowd kept reminding the comrades that the snake's skin is incredibly thick and its venom is life-threatening. From nowhere, Chen Beiming appeared, holding the blade he found at home. He waved it around as if he were a seasoned hunter. Among the fighters, he aroused both terror and admiration and confusion. Getting close to the snake, the guy only roughly measured its length. Blinded by the excitement of battle, Beiming swung his blade at the monster. With a single blow, he dealt the snake a fateful blow that made the brute hiss and heave in pain. But the beast did not think of giving up, and only wanted to take revenge on his offender by taking him with him. The terrified fighters fled the battlefield in terror, hoping to escape the monster's all-consuming fury. But surging through the air, the tree serpent fell senselessly at the feet of its executioner. It was Chen Beiming. Surprised voices were heard from the crowd. No one understood who could defeat the monster so easily. Wu Gaoxian, who had arrived, asked the newly minted hero if he was okay, to which the guy just told his friend to find people to help deal with the snake and sell it. The voices in the crowd did not stop wondering who was the guy who had handled the monster so swiftly. Suddenly, one of the hunters asked who gave Beiming permission to touch the tree snake. Then the young man decided that the stranger wanted his trophy. The hunter's eyes read incomprehension as to how one guy unknown to anyone could defeat a tree serpent. Looking at Beiming, the experienced fighter realized that he had only reached his initial stage. He studied the young man with his eyes, hoping to find a clue and figure out who he was. His gaze fell on the boy's blade. Now the hunter wondered how he had gotten a deity-level weapon. Ignoring the questions arising in his head, he decided to offer Beiming to compensate for his fighter's efforts in the battle with the serpent. But Chen Beiming objected to him not understanding what compensation could be talked about if he did all the work himself. In turn, the hunter offered to trade the trophy snake for the guy's dagger. The stranger's thoughts were already full of fantasies of how the weapon would improve his life and how successful he would be with it. There was only mockery in Beiming's eyes, for he knew the level of weaponry he was dealing with. Wu Gaoxian, who was standing behind him, suddenly intervened in the conversation. He wanted to convince his friend that he didn't have to give anything to anyone. The enraged hunter was dumbfounded by the boy's words and decided that he should be deprived of his life. One of the hunters swung at Wu Gaoxian to do his leader's bidding. There was only a whistling sound in the air. Before he knew it, the boy fell to the ground to the taunts of the hunters. His friend immediately ran up to him to inquire about the guy's condition. He was pissed. Fortunately, Gaoxian was fine. Beiming helped his friend up and recovered from the unexpected blow. Angry laughter could be heard from the crowd of hunters. The assailant claimed it was only 30% of his strength. But the taunts were destined to cease, for Beiming was not a man to be offended. Enraged, he lunged at the crowd of hunters to avenge their unjust words. The boy's act caused a mixed reaction among the hunters. Only the sound of the ringleader's warning brought the hunters back to concentration. One of the guys clearly underestimated the seriousness of his opponent. He stood there and kept saying that Beiming couldn't fight him. As if out of nowhere, the boy was joined by his fighting spirit Snowball, which in turn caused another wave of ridicule of the fictional object of weakness. Summoning his fighting spirit in the guise of a fast-tailed wolf, the hunter sicked it on the boys. Beaming with eyes full of love, gave the command for the beast to attack the wolf. Fluffy rushed at the monster with joy. From the outside, it looked like an unequal fight. The crowd of fighters laughed as they realized that Fluffy was no match for the ferocious beast. The insolent man rushed at Beiming as he went, shouting that the fight between the hunters was fierce and intense. There was the sound of a blade cutting through the air. It was the only sound the participants in the conflict could hear. The hunter's arm separated from his body, and he howled in horror at the onset of sudden, intolerable pain. A silent shadow of respect and adoration for Chen Beiming swept across the squad of fighters. When he had finished with his assailant, he turned to the main hunter and mockingly asked if he still wanted his dagger. The wounded man's cries were unceasing. He shouted that his fighting spirit would deal with Snowball at once. The wolf threw himself at the fluffy one, who didn't hesitate for a moment and immediately took the fight, whose fate seemed to be sealed. The beast howled, and a wave of terror swept through the crowd of stunned fighters. Fluffy straddled his opponent's muzzle triumphantly and shrieked enthusiastically at his offender's cries. In his paws was the wolf's core. Now the shocked hunter had to admit unconditional defeat. Even Wu Gaoxian was amazed by the strength of the small, visually harmless beast. Beiming lovingly petted the pet and said his arrival was the happiest moment of his life. His attention now turned to the humiliated hunter. His fate was now in the boy's hands. Wu Gaoxian objected to killing the hunter because he was from a prominent family. But Beiming said that the family of the guy with the last name Hong is not that famous and dare not treat his friend like that. Then the boy swore that no one could ever hurt or harm his friend again, because he had helped his little sister Shuer. The boy's words were interrupted by the shrieking Hong's call to battle. He pointed his battle companions at his friends. The maddened mob rushed at the boys, promising revenge for their young master. Beiming cast a glance in the direction of the hunters and took a moment to assess the situation. Suddenly, the tree serpent that seemed to be dead rose up and threw itself at the guy. In all its glory, it rose above the ground and made a loud sound, terrifying the participants of the battle. There was a deafening whistle of a dagger in the air, and the serpent's body disintegrated into several pieces. One of the monster's pieces fell right at the feet of the discouraged hunters. Enjoying the triumph, Beiming noticed that his opponent's battle spirits had already fallen. The chief hunter stood silently staring down. He seemed to have already admitted defeat. As he fell to the ground, With began to turn to the great martial artist. He asked him to apologize to the Grand Master's friend on behalf of the young master and muttered about compensation. Beiming stood at a distance from him and already seemed to be relaxed after the past battle. Just as suddenly, the hunter got off the ground and pounced on the unsuspecting young man. Smugly smiling, the guy reminded him of the power of his flawless weapon that was waiting for its time in the hands of the wielder. A dagger whistle sounded, and the wound inflicted on the hunter spurted blood, and the lifeless body of the old man fell to the ground. In response to the surprised cries of the fighters, Beiming continued to enjoy having one less bad guy to deal with. He had punished him by taking his life. Looking at the dumbfounded crowd, he found Hong with his eyes, and turning to him said that he was next. Terrified at the possibility of repeating the fate of the old man, the boy began to shout, recalling the family he came from. But they were only pleas. Two horsemen appeared through the thick of the forest. They stood at a distance and watched the scene. One asked the other in surprise if Beiming would be able to kill Hong, but in response, the second rider only noted that if it was fated to happen, the boy's family would do nothing to avenge the offender. Wu Gaoxian leaned over Hong's lifeless body. He seemed surprised by his friend's action. Beiming interrupted the boy's fears by saying that he would deal with any offenders who tried to do anything against him or his family. With curiosity and apprehension, he looked around at the confused hunters. He wondered if anyone would dare attempt his prey. One of the guys picked up on Beiming's bravery and said their fight would be interesting. The experienced hunter looked at Snowball thoughtfully and said that he was not as simple as he seemed, because he could easily absorb the cores of other battle spirits. Examining the weapon, he immediately realized that Beiming was unusual. He couldn't remember him in Luon City before. The writer decided that the guy was not from around here since he had massacred a representative of the Hong family, who were quite respected in the town. It was clear that no one there had the same level of confidence and strength as Beiming. One fighter looked at the guy's features and said he looked familiar. He warned his comrades to stay where they were. Perrin recognized the Chen family representative, who had been kicked out by Patriarch Dongfang. Those present had no doubt that Chen Beiming was in front of Nietzsche. One of the fighters remembered the guy's parents who helped him become a hunter, but it was all for nothing, because the guy never cultivated. At that moment, all Beiming cared about was the tree snake the other hunters were attempting to kill. They kept shouting that the beast should go to them, because they had put a lot of effort and lives to deal with the monster. The rider got off his horse and offered Beiming to share the snake, noting that the other hunters weren't as stupid as the Hong family guy. He hinted that in the event of an equal division, the city of Luon would have the support of the hunters. But the boy seemed adamant. He grinned at the remaining hunters. One of the guys threw himself at Baming, hoping to punish him for being rude and unwilling to share. He swung at the young man, but he dodged the hunter's weapon. Baming grabbed his arm and pulled him to him. Thus, the boy was trapped. Now, the boy felt the coldness of the dagger against his neck. He could only trust his fate and wait silently. Terrorizing those around him, Baming said he needed money and ordered the hunters to collect everything of value they had on them. The fighters were shocked by this statement because the guy really wanted to rob them. They shouted that they would take his life. Only the writer realized that this was not the young man's plan. He was looking for an excuse to fight. The guy in Baming's hands began to shout that he alone could not handle all of them, urging his comrades to join the battle. Lao Er Dongfang was taken hostage, and now, according to Baming, he had to answer for his insolence. With horror, the boy screamed, begging his father to save him from reprisal. Baming sent the boy to the ground with one blow. He fell to the ground in horror when he heard his father's screams. Luckily, the guy was alive. He got to his feet and started breathing heavily, trying to get away from what had happened. When he came to his senses, the young man was distraught. He shouted at Baming, unable to understand how he could be so insolent. Trying to straighten up, the guy realized that something had happened to his back because he couldn't get back on his feet. He begged his father to kill Baming and avenge the pain he had suffered in battle. Speaking his son's name, he urged the hunters to throw themselves into battle so as not to live with the humiliation. Baming realized that the fighters had clearly overestimated themselves. He had strength and power on his side. The hunters swarmed towards the guy, obediently obeying Mr. Dongfang's call. Baming's confidence was bolstered by past events. After all, compared to what he had experienced, his enemies were negligible. There was the sound of battle. Weapons clinked loudly as they clashed against each other. One of the hunters swung at the boys, shouting that he would accept death by his sword now. Baming dodged, and the guy fell with a thunderous crash, thrusting his weapon into the ground. Seizing the moment, the young man rushed into the fray, deftly using his dagger in action. The elder Dongfang tried to take revenge on the guy and lunged at him, screaming that he would take his life. But Baming threw him off the battlefield as well, causing a wave of terror among those who had not yet rushed into battle. Looking at the boy, they had to admit that the young man was beyond them. Having disposed of his assailants, he looked around the battlefield where the hunters lay. In their faces, he recognized representatives of the noble families of the city of Luone. He suggested that Gaoxian remove all valuables from the lifeless bodies of the hunters. The friend was surprised by the young man's offer. He was afraid there might be a problem. But Baming assured the lad that there was nothing to fear, and that in case of emergency, he would take care of them himself and make him a hunter. The friend couldn't believe what he was hearing. He looked adoringly at the boy, hoping he hadn't heard those words. Baming only laughed at Gaoxian's words and called for a look around the battlefield to collect valuable items. Now, the friend promised to follow the guy's words unquestioningly because he became like a mentor for him. Gaoxian was glad to be able to show off his new status soon. After examining the finds, the guys realized that all the things wouldn't be worth the 2 million the guys were counting on. Even a hovering kite wouldn't make up for it. Baming continued to lament that such noble families didn't have the money he needed. Suddenly, the friend's eyes fell on a guy lying next to a tree. They thought he was pretending to be asleep. They examined the body carefully, listening for breathing and looking for signs of life. Baming slapped the guy on the cheek and he stopped pretending to be asleep. He immediately began begging his friends to let him go and not take his precious life. Baming's mind immediately conceived a cunning plan. They decided to release the boy so that he could tell Luan what had happened and tell them that he was waiting for a ransom. A sudden sound interrupted the boy's speech. He turned around to look for the source of the sound. At this time, the captive began to shout that the Patriarch had arrived on the battlefield, and now he was begging the guys to save him. Pillars of dust appeared on the horizon, heralding the imminent arrival of uninvited guests. In an attempt to gauge the real situation of affairs, Baming looked away and waited for developments. A large number of vehicles were kicking up columns of dust behind them. They raced aggressively toward the battlefield. The boys continued to stand silently, though their eyes read that they already knew what was going on. Cars stopped, and people began to get out of them, adding to the tension of the moment. One of the men who came out introduced himself. It was the Patriarch of the Hong Gentao family. Other men followed his example. They all belonged to families of fighters who had passed away. The Patriarch of the Dongfang family also came out. His name was Xinqiang. He looked around menacingly. The surviving boys began to shout with joy. They rejoiced because they expected to be rescued. Lining up, the men moved forward. They were hunters of the highest level. One of the servants approached Dongfang and said something in his ear while looking back at Baming. The boy recognized the fighters as members of the Chen family. The Patriarch couldn't believe that a young man had done all this. He was surprised that the guy had become a hunter, let alone handled a soaring serpent, and straightened out professional fighters. The Patriarch looked around and saw the body of his son Bin, his eyes filled with rage. Examining the body, he howled with mortification. Now he wanted to find the culprit. Tears dripped from his eyes. It seemed as if everything around him had lost its voices. It was the father's way of saying goodbye to his son. One of the fighters pointed a finger at Beiming, saying he was the killer. He is the one who caused such damage, took valuables, and wants to fight off the hovering kite. The Patriarch shouted at Beiming. He couldn't believe that he was the cause of all the trouble. He also couldn't believe how a guy from the elementary level could do this. The Patriarch vowed to kill Beiming to appease the soul of his late son who had fallen in battle. The confrontation began to gain new momentum. Flashes of light flashed between the opponents. It seemed as if the earth was about to break apart from this. The Patriarch's fighting spirit appeared on the battlefield. It was a fearsome beast, instilling fear in everyone present. In one of the flashes of light, the blade of a dagger gleamed. The weapon was at the ready. In a moment, it seemed that the beast retreated, frightened by the brilliance. Beiming looked around for the monster. After looking at the Patriarch's spirit power, the guys concluded that it was a thunder marten. The Patriarch was surprised that the marten was afraid of the weapon. In so many years, he had never seen fear in its little eyes. Looking at Beiming, he said that his dagger wouldn't be able to solve all his problems, and that he wouldn't be able to achieve what he wanted. The marten continued to hover at her master's feet, and silence hung between the opponents. One of the Patriarchs was surprised that the weapon scared the thunder marten. After all, no one had ever seen such a thing before. The other noted the guy's talent, still not believing his eyes but not showing it to others. One of the hunter's soldiers asked if we should start acting to punish the insolent man. But Dongfang said that this problem was promised to be solved by the Patriarch of the Hong family. In turn, everyone wondered how limitless Beiming's abilities were. After all, everyone thought he was just a child. The young man tensed, expecting a blow from his opponent. Snowball sat on his shoulder. At that moment, the thunder marten made her move. It leaped towards the boys and let out a frightening howl. Without waiting for his master's command, Snowball went to meet his attacker. He seemed to be excited about the battle. Patriarch Hong also rushed towards the guy. He was sure that a normal dagger was not enough to defeat him. Fear and doubt flashed in Beiming's eyes, but he knew he could not surrender to his enemy's pleasure. At the same time, Snowball reached the marten. He opened its mouth and threw it aside with force. There was a pitiful howl as the beast flew off to the side. It seemed to be finished. The Patriarch kept attacking the guy. No one wanted to give in. Now Beiming realized that he was facing a really strong opponent and that he had to try his best to win. He met the hunter's eyes. He was clearly choosing his tactics and deciding which side to attack the boy from. Beiming continued to sarcastic, his opponent calling his attempted attacks a small fighter's technique. It drove the hunter into a rage. It blinded his eyes. Now rash moves awaited him around every corner. He reached out to the guy and something happened that no one could have expected. At least this soon. A wave of horror and surprise swept through the Patriarchs. They all stood silent and continued to watch the events unfold. Beiming pierced the hunter's arm with his dagger and caustically commented that his technique was capable of splitting mountains. Like a learned script, the guy talked about his technique and said that despite his status, a Patriarch couldn't comprehend it. The shocked and almost defeated hunter drew back. Sighs echoed through the crowd. Younger hunters rushed to their lord, offering assistance in bandaging and treating the wound. The Patriarch had no choice but to admit that he had been defeated by the boy at the very initial stage. The fighters recognized that Beiming easily countered Hong Juntao's ferocious technique. Everyone realized that the merit of the guy was his dagger, which hit a powerful and invincible force. The fighters continued to wonder how an ordinary guy could have a deity-level weapon. After all, no one in the Chen family had ever developed a weapon of this type. So, this was impossible. And even stranger was the appearance of this tool 2 years after the kid's parents disappeared. There were many questions about Snowball, too. On a visual level, he seemed to pose no threat, but in battle he showed himself in the most unexpected ways. Then the hunter assumed that someone very powerful was behind Beiming. The fight between Snowball and the Thunder Marten continued. Now the hunters had doubts about the victory of their spirit. After a short struggle, Snowball possessed the Marten's core. Now that meant victory. Hong couldn't believe what was happening, because his spirit power was the fiercest creature that no one had ever been able to defeat before. He bent over the Marten and scratched it behind its ear one last time, as if acknowledging its weakness. A satisfied Snowball jumped onto his master's shoulder. He was obviously pleased with his success. Hong immediately gave the command for the offensive. He still believed in victory. The enthusiastic fighters supported the Patriarch's command and began the attack with loud cheers. The hunters surrounded Beiming. Everyone wanted to stand out to gain the approval of the higher-ups. The guys saw 2 advanced-level hunters heading towards him. Immediately following them were 5 ordinary ones. Everything about them gave away the difference in training. Beiming waved his finger at the 2 main ones, causing the experienced fighters to look surprised. He boldly told them to all attack the boy at once. The young man's self-confidence knew no bounds at that moment. There was an awkward pause. It was clear that the Hong family could not win this battle, and were now doing their best not to lose face. The elder hunters realized that the battle was futile because Beiming possessed divine weapons, and his capabilities were limitless. One of the patriarchs said the Hongs had no other way to handle the guy. At that time, one of the hunters looked at the young man's face and thought he looked familiar. It was as if he had seen him somewhere before. Beiming continued to sarcasm in an attempt to sap his opponent's morale. He said that the Hong family was not as strong as it claimed to be. Very young recruits stood up to defend their masters. They were ready to rush into battle to show and prove their loyalty. One of the hunters immediately began trying to attack while warning his comrades of the dagger's danger. The advancing fighters were whispering. They sincerely thought that if they all attacked together, they would be able to overpower the guy. With a shout, they rushed at the motionless Beiming. He, in turn, seemed not to have been touched at all by the fight. With one swing of his dagger, he laid the hunter on the ground and waited for further attacks from the wounded man's comrades. But the fighters were afraid. They knew they could not resist the power that Beiming and his dagger possessed. Doubt swept through the crowd. No one could believe that the young man was only in the beginning stages. Even a veteran from the Hong family couldn't reach the guy. That alone was a testament to his strength. One of the hunters cried out in horror. He remembered where he had seen Beiming. He told the crowd that the young man was the son-in-law of the Dongfang family. There were cheers. Some assumed the boy was just a weapon against the Hong family, and some feared that Yuan would no longer be as calm as before. Then Patriarch Hong threw himself at Dongfang with a shriek, thinking that he had set him up. A silent pause hung over the people. It seemed as if it would last forever. Gaoxian's voice made Beiming turn around. The boy was startled by what was happening. Beiming asked him where he had been missing all this time and if his friend was doing well. Trying to straighten up, Gaoxian said he hid during the fight, but his eyes still stared into the ground. Looking around the battlefield and seeing the bodies of the dead and wounded, he wondered how a friend could defeat them all by himself. Beiming only smiled presumptuously and said that no one could hurt him. The friend didn't understand what further action they should take to get away with it. But Beiming suggested his friend just wait for things to settle down. After all, it wasn't his war anymore. The tension between the patriarchs was at an all-time high. Not being enemies, they already hated each other. Hong began to prove that they had never been enemies, but the death of his son at the hands of his son-in-law Dongfang spoke for itself. The patriarchs demanded an explanation from 7 Dongfang as the question seemed incredibly logical. But the hunter denied any connection to Beiming. He claimed that their relationship was a thing of the past. The engagement had been broken off, which meant that the Chen family was nothing more than a story of days gone by. To back up his words, Dongfang said he wouldn't stop Hong from massacring Beiming, but he decided that it was just a trick because he was not able to fight after the experience. Believing what they heard, the hunters began to think about how a guy could have a weapon of divine level. One of them shouted that the harm done by the boy would not just go away, and that if he was not stopped, Luoni would one day fall at his feet. Therefore, he called on all hunters, regardless of their affiliation, to stand shoulder to shoulder with Hongami and massacre Chen Beiming. There was a pause. The patriarchs looked at each other. There were more words in their gazes than they could have said in words in that tense moment. The elders began to consult. Each realized that their lives in Yuan were at stake, for if they lost, they could not return home to the life they had become accustomed to. There were a few claps and a call for attention to the clapper. It was Beiming. He asked the hunters to pay him for the wounded and killed, as they had previously discussed with Gaoxian. The patriarch's eyes widened. No one would have thought such insolence was possible. But after thinking, the elders made the only right decision to pay the amount the guy said. One by one, they began to agree, citing that it was not a ransom, but a payment for watching a great fight. Only Patriarch Hong could not accept what was happening. He continued to stare at the boy in discouragement. A loud sound interrupted the men from counting money and justifying payments. Everyone immediately turned around. Hundreds of eyes, glittering with rage, appeared in the column of dust. The crowd gasped. Looking at what was happening, Beiming could only whisper. He recognized the fog of beasts in the incomprehensible phenomenon. One by one, the elders wondered why the fog was so thick. After all, it was essentially a poisonous mist caused by demonic creatures. Beiming was tormented by the question of just how many beasts were in the fog and how many more monsters could be found emerging from their lairs. He was interrupted from his musings by the voice of his friend, who urged him to run away from the scene, to save himself. The boy remained silent, looking at his valuables-laden friend. He was trying to figure out if his resurrection could have changed the course of time and triggered the siege so early. The events of the past, when Beiming couldn't save his little sister Shuer, flashed through his mind. Now, he was ready to do everything possible to make sure that the events of the past would never happen again. Gaoxian kept insisting that it was time to leave this creepy place to protect themselves. In response, Beiming demanded that his friend go to town to protect his baby sister. In turn, he'll return right after he's done with the demonic beasts. Saying that, the boy rushed towards the fog. No one knew what might be waiting for him there. The patriarchs left the battlefield in a hurry. They knew they had to leave before the fog reached the living. Indiscriminately, they started loading the dead, wounded, and alive into trucks. It was a chance for rescue. One of the young hunters spotted Chen Beiming running towards the fog. He stopped a couple steps away from him and was now considering his next actions. The recklessness of the boy surprised the experienced hunters, who realized that even all the fighters at once would not have enough strength and power to cope with the fog. One of the patriarchs had to state the fact that if nothing was done, Luon City would soon fall under the mist of the beasts. Dongfang then ordered all of his family members to prepare for battle, no matter how it ended. One by one, they picked up the order and passed it on to the other families. Everyone realized that their task was to slow the fog's advance on the city at least. It seemed as if all the families had united into one common family for the sake of the goal said by Patriarch Dongfang earlier. Ignoring what was happening, Beiming continued to stand like a stump at the edge of the fog. He gazed into the mesmerizing thick of it. The faces of various beasts flashed in it. All of them had a terrible grin. Suddenly, out of the fog, a ferocious wolf headed towards Beiming while baring its fangs. But the young man was unbreakable. With a smirk, he promised the beast that it would die first. An angry wolf's head emerged from the fog. Its body was many times the size of the boy's. Beiming quickly assessed the situation, smirked, and exchanged an approving glance with his friend Snowball. As he accelerated and pushed off the ground, he threw the fluffy thing straight towards the wolf's mouth. Snowball squealed happily and moved towards the brute, enjoying the moment of his triumph. The wolf was shocked when he saw the fluffy ball of fluff flying up. How could he defeat a spirit that was dozens or even hundreds of times smaller than himself? At this moment, Beiming launched an attack. He bared his dagger and jumped towards the monster. With precise movements of his weapon, he inflicted the wolf with unbearable pain that made the beast howl. It was so strong that without realizing it, he threw the guy off him and continued to growl pitifully. But in the pitiful howl, there was a call. The call of his kin to help. Beiming began to peer into the thick of the fog, and those he didn't expect to see began to emerge. At a loud growl, the fog began to clear and other wolves began to emerge from it. They came to the aid of the wounded man. One of them rushed in the direction of the guy who was still standing motionless, thinking over a plan of action in his head. Gathering his strength, he struck the wolf a blow that sent it flying off to the side. One by one, Beiming slaughtered the beasts, until they all fell. A wolf bent over him, and the battle began. He raised his paw menacingly, preparing to attack and avenge his pack. His eyes were bloodshot. He also continued to growl menacingly. The wolf rushed at Beiming, but the wolf struck him with his dagger in a deft move. Now the boy gave the command for Snowball to attack. Now everything depended on the furry lump. There was a deafening howl, and a flash of light illuminated everything in the area. Beiming looked at the dying wolf and proudly declared that even he was too weak to resist the guy. Suddenly, a strange stone flew out of the fog. It was heading toward the boy. He froze for a second, trying to figure out how it could have happened. Looking at the approaching stone, Beiming realized that it was someone's power. The guy dodged at the last moment, but the wave still threw him away. If he'd been a few centimeters closer, he'd be dead already. Alive and stunned, he continued to feel the effects of the attack. His legs were shaking and numb. A flash of light illuminated the battlefield again, and Beiming looked toward the rock. Something seemed to be moving there. The demonic monkeys appeared out of the mist. They came out to the loud screeching of each other. The sounds drowned out all living things around them. Without wasting a moment, Beiming shouted at Snowball to get away from the fierce wolf's body. The joyous Fluffball left the wolf's body to a loud chirp and jumped out at his master's call. Already on the approach, one of the monkeys grabbed Snowball. Beiming cried out at the sudden wave of terror and fear that came over him. The monsters rushed at the fighters with a shriek. Their quick movements left no time for the guys to make thoughtful decisions. Beiming tried to deal with them using his dagger. He wielded it skillfully and took down the monkeys one by one. Suddenly, one of the monkeys was grabbed by someone's steady hand. It was Gaoxian. He grabbed the monster by the muzzle and lifted it off the ground, causing its legs to sag. The boy promised the monsters that he would deal with them without any regret at any attempt to attack his friend. With a deft move, he disposed of the monkey and set off towards the others, causing them to scatter quickly. The hunters didn't waste any time either. They aimed their weapons and fired shots in the hope of killing the beasts. The arrows flying over Beiming hit the target. The monsters fell to the ground and writhing in their last throes. One of the monkeys caught Snowball between her palms. With a questioning look at her hands, she opened them to see her prey. But inside was no longer a fluffy, harmless lump, but an enraged monster with burning eyes ready to strike. Gaoxian ran up to the other to ask about his health and examine his wound. Beiming thanked the boy for saving his life. But Wu wryly remarked that he couldn't do otherwise, since if the guy died, his sister Shuer would tear the big guy apart. Amidst all of this, the shocked monkey continued to stare at Snowball in her captivity. The guys were surprised. They didn't understand how such a small martial spirit could resist the demonic ape king. Beiming realized that his friend had absorbed the wolf core while inside it. Now his power was almost infinite. With a good burst of speed, Snowball threw himself right into the king's face. A wave of blood and a loud sound paused the battle. The guys stood silently and couldn't believe that their friend could handle such a powerful beast. Having gotten the core and not wasting a moment, Snowball began chewing it right as it flew. The hunters were also surprised at what had happened. Not only was Pian's weapon now questionable, but also his fighting spirit in defeating a middle-class monster. Then one of them decided that Snowball was a mutated beast, since he only used brute force instead of special abilities. Hong watched what was happening, and at that moment, he vowed to get even with Beiming for his son's death, as soon as they all returned to Luon City. Now the Patriarchs and their fighters watched as the demonic beasts retreated. One of them offered to take advantage of the wounds and injuries Beiming inflicted and finish the guy off. But the Patriarch didn't like the idea. Instead, he ordered to search the bodies of the demonic beasts and treat the wounded. Beiming looked thoughtfully at what was happening. His jowls played with anger. Suddenly, Snowball sprang from his seat. The beast was holding in its paws a huge pink bag that was dozens of times its size. Beiming touched the sack-like organ of the beast. There was a light coming from it. Without thinking long, the guy cut open the bag, and everyone saw its contents. Inside the organ were multicolored stones. The boys recognized them as animal balls. Gaoxian asked his friend if these eggs could have been wolf eggs. He continued to stare, mesmerized at the find. Beiming decided that they were the eggs of different beasts, for they were all different in color size and light. He took one of the eggs and examined it carefully. Now he wondered how they all ended up inside one monster. They were much more powerful than the wolf that had protected them. Some of them were alive and moving. Beiming smiled and held out the egg to his friend, offering to grow his own fighting spirit from it. The guy was surprised by such a proposal, because earlier he never thought that he could get such an opportunity. Beiming handed him the 4 eggs lying in his hand and suggested he choose one. The young man looked at the find with interest and tried his best to choose a friend he could raise himself. Beiming's hand suddenly shook and clenched. Gaoxian thought it was due to his slowness in choosing, but the guy kept squirming from the sudden incomprehensible flare-up squeezing his body. It was a negative reaction from the large amount of energy obtained from the nuclei of the beasts that Snowball had eaten. Now the boy was glad his friend was sleeping peacefully on his shoulder, though he wondered how so much could fit in a small lump. Beiming glanced at the hunters. He knew he had to break through them before the beast's energy came out. The Patriarchs and their families began to hurriedly pack up and leave the battlefield, all except for Hong, who looked ominously toward the boys. Beiming grabbed his friend's shoulder and said they should go back to keep themselves safe. Before Gaoxian could react, the guy grabbed him by the scruff of his neck and hurled him away from the battlefield. The young man screamed and begged his friend to slow down. He was seasick and nauseous as he walked. He could hardly move his feet. In the Chen family's house, everything was very quiet, peaceful, and calm. He was basking in the sunlight and was too far away from everything that was happening in the forest. Shuer was going about her daily routine as usual. Right now, she was peacefully sweeping the floors. But a sudden sound and a swirl of dust knocked her off her feet. She closed her eyes and nose and looked around, trying to figure out what had happened. Turning around, she saw Gaoxian lying against the wall. The boy was trying to catch his breath. A loud slamming sound came from the second floor. Someone closed the door sharply. Shui took stock of the situation and decided that her little brother was finally back. Upstairs in a room on the second floor, a pensive Beiming sat on the bed. Snowball was lying on the blanket next to him. It was clear from his sniffling that the animal was recovering from a successful fight. Beiming recalled the Beast Sutra, with which it was possible to refine the Heavenly Union technique. It also helped to recover from battle and heal wounds. Opening his eyes, Beiming was surprised. He was now somewhere outside his room. Something began to coil around his body. It was something scaly. It was a hovering tree serpent that grabbed and lifted the guy. Looking around, Beiming saw other monsters as well. They were a monkey and a wolf. He realized with horror that it was these very beasts trying to influence his mind. The boy strained with all his might. He tried to convince his mind that it was just his imagination. Breathing heavily, he opened his eyes. Luckily, the room was familiar to him, and Snowball was still lying on the bed, with eggs on the other side. Beiming fell back on his pillow without strength and seemed to fall asleep. Scarcely had his face touched hers. The weather outside the window was beautiful. The sun was shining, and there was not a single cloud in the sky. Beiming opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling before he could recover from sleep. The boy stood up and grabbed his head. He tried to understand what was happening to him. An unexpected thought entered the boy's mind. He realized that he had moved to a new intermediate level. It was just a little bit away and it would be advanced. Beiming looked at the snoring beast next to him and concluded that if he gave him a little more beast energy, things would end badly. The boy looked the other way. His gaze fell on the objects lying on the bed. It was a dagger and balls. As he looked at them, memories from the past began to flash through his mind. He remembered that he had put one of the weapons away in a distant drawer of unnecessary things long ago. After rummaging through cardboard boxes and a lot of junk, the guy pulled out a crossbow demon splitter. The guy smiled smugly as now no one could harm him. His thoughts were interrupted by voices coming from the first floor. Someone was asking for help. Beaming called out to Gaoxian, who had been left to look after his little sister earlier. He left the room and looked down where he saw his friend lying next to the wall. There was no doubt that something had happened. With a deft movement, the boy swung over the railing and jumped down. He was furious at what he saw. The room was full of hunters. They stood at a distance and looked questioningly at the young man who had appeared. The brother asked Shuer what was going on here and why all these people were in their house. The frightened girl said that Beiming slept for 2 days, and during that time, the Hong family wanted to get his friend's loyalty. After refusing, he was beaten up. The boy was surprised that he had slept for 2 days. He remembered that last time it took him 3 days to reach the warrior level. Shuer continued. The Hongs also promised that if they didn't obey them, they would kill Wu and the Chen family. The sister's story was interrupted by voices from the crowd. They decided to remind themselves and confirm the girl's words. They were Yuan Qingya and Yuan Ming's grandfather and grandson. The old man said that they had come on the Patriarchs' orders to force Gaoxian to join the Yuan family. Beiming looked questioningly in the direction of the uninvited guests. He tried to remember everything he had heard about this family. The old man continued his story. He also suggested that the boy join the Yuan family as their patriarch wanted. Shuer continued to examine her friend and his wounds. The boy was coughing and showing that he wasn't feeling well. Yuan Qing'ai hinted that this is a generous offer for the guy's real situation. But Beiming didn't care about the Hong family. He was afraid that those people could see his friend's potential and exploit it. Seeing the boy only as a barbarian, they could prevent him from developing, leaving all hope for the hunter's fate only in his thoughts. Beiming shrugged his shoulders, thanked for the generous offer, and said that he and his friend would not be able to join them. The Yuan family was surprised by this response because they thought that such cooperation would benefit them all. Min thought the boy's words were impertinent because he came from a rich, noble family. He began to threaten and say that if he didn't accept their offer, he could destroy the boys and their house. A frightened Shun lifted Gaoxian from the floor and looked hopefully toward her brother, begging to protect their home. But Beiming was more confident in his strength than ever. He now had a new level weapon and combat experience. The dialogue was interrupted by a black lump that flew into the room with speed. It sounded like a bird. Feathers began to fly around the room. They fell on the floor and distracted the characters from what was happening. The feathers were followed by the stench of the bird. 2 bloodthirsty vultures landed on the shoulders of the Yuan family representatives. All participants of the events began to cover their noses and wonder where such an unpleasant odor could come from. They began to run out of the house, hoping to no longer smell the stinking odors coming from the birds. Shuer also cried out from the stench. She could hardly breathe, but she continued to complain anyway. Beiming ordered his little sister to take her friend and wait for him in the upstairs bedroom until his brother allowed them to go out. Qingya didn't expect that the guy might have wanted to fight him and decided to teach him a lesson just like many others. He promised the guy that now he's destined to lose his life. Shuer took Gaoxian into a room so the boy could exhale and take a breather, but her thoughts remained preoccupied with the fate of her brother, left behind to protect his family and home. On the first floor, Beiming continued his dialogue with guests who were clearly not welcome in their home. He answered the old man and his grandson defiantly and made them even more furious. It was Min who was the first one who couldn't stand the impertinence. He shouted at the boy, promising to teach him some manners. His vulture flew off his shoulder and also began to hunt the young man, doing anything to help his master. Min swung his swords at Beiming. As he fought, he continued to dream of his triumphant victory in front of his own grandfather, but Beiming fended off the big man's attack and threw him back a couple of meters. Taking advantage of the moment, the guy immediately prepared his crossbow and hid his dagger behind his back so that everything would be at hand at the right moment. Min's fervor didn't die down and he continued to attack the guy. The opponents clashed in battle. Sparks seemed to fly from their blows. Beiming threw his guest into the wall, knocking him into it with a thud. Now the guy understood who he was dealing with because the young man's strength knew no bounds. Already almost resigned to Minya's defeat, the crowd of gawkers standing at the door marveled at the boy's abilities and their lord's loss. The grandfather tried to encourage his grandson and kept telling him not to do rash things that would ruin him. A loud sound of a flying bird was heard above Beiming. The vulture was already ready to attack the boy and avenge his master. But the quick-acting boy killed the bird with a single blow of his dagger. Minya's rage knew no bounds, for just now his bloodthirsty vulture had fallen without fulfilling its purpose. Grabbing his weapon, he swung at the guy, wanting to pay him back for the death of his fighting spirit. Following him was the voice of his grandfather, who wanted to warn the boy against rash decisions. But it was too late, for the boy's eyes were already covered with a veil of horror, of rage and grief. In one blow, Beiming dispatched Ming, finishing him off with his dagger. Coughing, the enemy fell to the floor. He was still giving signs of life. Beiming enjoyed his next victory. It was as if he knew in advance that his opponent didn't stand a chance. Seeing what was happening, Qingya rushed to the aid of his grandson, who could hardly speak anymore. Min asked his grandfather to avenge him. It was the only thing he could say. The old man made a vow to his dying grandson that he would fulfill his last request no matter what it cost him. Looking at Beiming, he turned to him, reminding him that they had come with good intentions, and the guy had behaved this way with them. The old man now had no choice but to fight the boy and wash his honor. Almost shouting, he swore he would end the guy for the sake of his family and his fallen grandson. He ordered the use of the cleavage claws to his vulture, which snapped off its master's shoulder on command. Beiming began to strain his memory and recall everything he knew about the bird's claws. Then he assumed that the feathered one belonged to the royal lineage who possessed unique abilities. He later realized that then the bird's unique ability would show up as soon as the bird moved to a more advanced level. The bird was already close by and didn't leave Beiming any time to think about making decisions. After losing precious resources, the guy realized that he couldn't withstand his opponent's fighting spirit. But before the boy could accept defeat, Snowball appeared out of nowhere and rushed to the bird and knocked it down on the fly. Beiming happily praised the pet himself, not expecting such a development. Snowball, on the other hand, flopped the bird down and continued to flutter it already in a fight on the floor. The old man didn't expect such an end and decided to act decisively, turning his attention to Beiming. With a hammer, he rushed toward the young man to prove the seriousness of his words. Like his grandson, he got into a fight with the guy who threw another punch. Old man Yuan continued to feel hatred towards the young man. Even a brief defeat couldn't stop him from killing his enemy. A whole group of cheerleaders had gathered in the doorway. They were talking and assessing their opponent's strength, as if they were stronger and more agile than they were. Chinya flew into the wall, creating a loud thud, but he didn't have time for self-pity. The young man's foot flew a few centimeters away from the old man and hit the wall. The old man dodged. One by one, striking Chin, I had to admit that the opponent was too strong for him. From the side, he saw Snowball, who was already baring his teeth and ready to take on the Vulture. In a moment, the furry man had already destroyed the fighting spirit of his master's rival. The old man realized it was a demonic beast. He couldn't believe that his bird of royal blood and unique abilities could die like this. The crowd in the doorway continued to comment on what was happening. No one had any doubt that Yuan would lose the battle. The old man gathered his last strength and seemed as if he had summoned all his abilities and experience to help him in this difficult battle. Using the Shadow Slice skill, Beiming separated the old man's arm from his body. The battle was over in the guy's favor. Surprise could be heard in the crowd as to how a young man could master such a technique at his average level of development. The guy turned around at the gawkers and asked who was next who wanted to fight him. But the frightened guys started babbling and saying that they had not come for that. They only brought money as an apology for the past events. Beiming smiled. Such an answer more than satisfied him, especially since he really needed the money. After collecting the plastic cards brought by the young men, the guy offered them to leave his house immediately. But the guys kept chomping down on invitations to join their families, promising better facilities for friends. As he ushered the men out, he remembered what he was going to ask them to do. The boys froze in anticipation. Then he ordered the bodies of the UN representatives to be returned to their families. The boys obeyed Master Chen's wish unquestioningly. Now they were calling him by that name. Grabbing the bodies as if they were their prey, the guests left the house amidst a buzz of animated conversation. The only sounds in the room were the death convulsions of a vulture hitting the floor after an unsuccessful battle with Snowball. In the room on the second floor, Shuer continued to treat Gaoxian's wounds. Squinting in pain, the boy was surprised that so many families had come for him with their offers. He thought of himself as an ordinary country boy, but the voice of Beiming interrupted his monologue. A friend said he deserved better. The boys turned around happily to see their brother enter. Their eyes were full of love and relief. Taking his friend by the shoulder, Beiming inquired as to the state of his health. Gaoxian complained about his scratches, even though he was sure they were nothing. All his friend said was that he'd take out anyone who wanted to hurt the boy. Rejoicing at the happy ending, Shuer clapped her hands and shouted that her brother was the best. Then the guy decided that now was the moment to finish the job that had been started on the battlefield where the serpent had fallen. He held out 4 eggs to the boys and suggested they choose their own fighting spirit. Not believing their eyes, they looked at the eggs with interest and seemed to have already imagined their future pets. Gaoxian chose an egg with a white shell. He reached out his hand and took it for himself. Shuer, on the other hand, favored the turquoise specimen. She held it and admired its beauty. Expertly, Beiming advised the newly minted owners to follow his instructions. The friends nodded their heads approvingly. They could see in their eyes that they were taking the job with full responsibility. Then Beiming told the boys to drop blood on the eggshells. His voice was as calm as his mentor's demeanor suggests. Now the boys had to let go of their thoughts and visualize the life inside, doling out in their imagination who was lurking there. Concentrating, they searched for a heartbeat and made a connection with their morale. It was labor-intensive work that was worth the effort. A moment more and the shell crunched, startling the boys and tearing them away from following Beiming's instructions. They started screaming because they had never seen anything like this before. Everything around them seemed frightening, but so amazing. Mysterious shadows began to emanate from the eggs. So far, they barely bore any resemblance to animals. Beiming watched from the sidelines. In the back of his mind, he was afraid that something would go wrong. A cloud of dust formed around the boys. It hung in the room and made it difficult to look at the process. Finally recovering, Gaoxian opened his eyes and came to a look of amazement. A small monkey was stretching in his arms. The boy couldn't believe that his fighting spirit was in front of him. It was an albino monkey. It looked at its new owner with surprised, sly eyes and made unintelligible noises. Shuya's egg also glowed in her hands, and the girl eagerly awaited the arrival of her pet. An incredibly beautiful and slender bird appeared in her palms. In front of her was the crane of the 9 heavens. Unable to believe his good fortune, Gaoxian said hello to his new friend. But instead of the expected greeting, there was only a murmuring sound from the beast. The monkey did his wet work, right on his master, giggling and smiling. Gaoxian shouted loudly at the beast, who, having finished what he had started, jumped off his master and ran away from him. He noticed the foul odor now surrounding him. The monkey was making faces on the table. She spanked herself on her little butt and thus celebrated her victory. Shuer laughed because she thought her friend's fighting spirit would be as big as a bear, but inside was such a little girl. While his friends tended to their new pets, Beiming pondered why such strong animals were born in a town like theirs. He didn't understand how that wolf had such strong balls, because they were hundreds of times stronger than his. Snowball, who was sitting on the guy's shoulder, licked viciously and glanced unkindly in the direction of the animals. When Beiming noticed this, he tickled the animal and told it to chill out and not eat the guy's new friends. The guy promised him that Snowball could eat any monsters they found later. A voice called out to the owner of the house. Shui assumed it was Zoya's older sister. Beiming hadn't expected her to come, so he was very surprised and looked angrily to where the voice came from. The young man ordered his friends to stay in the room until he authorized it. The guest entered the house unauthorized and settled on the first floor. She called loudly for Beiming. On seeing the girl, the owner of the house asked her the purpose of her visit. He showed that he was not happy to see her. Beiming reminded that he will not be selling any of the items in this house to close the debt. The girl was offended by the boy's words. She came to tell him that he should leave town because the Hong family was going to attack him. But Beiming didn't respond to the guest's words with gratitude. He said coldly that he was not going anywhere. Zioi began to shout that she was driven by good intentions and that the young man should listen to her. Beiming was adamant. He said that he did not want to deal with the Dongfang family, even if death awaited him. The girl rolled her eyes in annoyance. She hadn't expected such a reaction to her gesture of goodwill. Outside the house, the weather was beautiful. The leaves of the trees glistened in the sunlight, swaying serenely in the light breeze. The birdsong and sounds of nature were only interrupted by the footsteps of a young girl coming out of the Chen family's house. Zuoyi walked and muttered some words to herself. She was annoyed that she had come all this way for nothing. She turned back to the house and gave him an angry look, as if she wanted to insult at least him out of her resentment. She snorted that she would never have come here if it wasn't for her sister who was Beiming's fiancée back in the day. Her musings were interrupted by a voice that clearly recognized the girl as a member of the Dongfang family. Patriarch Hong appeared next to him. He caustically remarked that their families were no longer connected and asked what the young woman was doing there. The man thought that Patriarch Dongfang had sent his daughter here to deliver some message to the guy. In response, the girl began to shout, excusing her father and saying that she had come here on her own without anyone's guidance. Hong continued to insist on his point. Now his goal was to find out why Zuoyi had come to the Chen family. He kept mocking and saying that since the first sister didn't become Beiming's wife, so the second sister would. The girl's patience had run out. She attacked the old man to shut his mouth and not to say any more nasty things about her and her family. Hong, who had not expected the whip attack, lost his balance. Now he is silent. But sneers continued to fly from the men who had come along with the old man. Hong Ming-tu intercepted the girl's whip and caustically remarked that she was very naughty, just like the rumors said about her. The girl looked around at the talking guy and wondered if he was supposed to be the next head of the family. What she'd heard about him was that he was an advanced hunter, and all his deeds were covered by the Demon Extermination Alliance. He looked at the girl and promised to deal with her while his uncle attacked Beiming. There were a million thoughts running through Zoya's mind, and they were all focused on how to save the unsuspecting Chen family. Leaving Hong Sr. ordered his nephew not to let the girl stop them from carrying out their revenge. She screamed angrily at the guy trying to figure out what exactly he wanted to do to her, but he only let go of her whip and it fell to the ground, adding that he didn't want to hurt her, because that way he could ruin the relationship between their families. Besides, if they'd warned Beiming they were coming, it wouldn't have changed the outcome, and it would have hurt the young lady. But Zuoyi continued to insist that she had nothing to do with it. She only curled her whip languidly. Mintu noticed that since she didn't care about it, she wouldn't put a stick in the wheel and everything would go quickly and painlessly for her. His smug speech was interrupted by shouts coming from the Chen family's house. Another moment and several fighters flew right over the guys standing outside. Their bodies fell to the ground with a clatter, raising columns of dust behind them. Zuoyi was surprised and annoyed that the guy didn't listen to her and didn't take the moment to run away. Mintu looked in disgust at the fighters falling one by one to the ground. They were begging for help. He grabbed his weapon and arrogantly declared that he would now deal with Beiming himself. One by one, the Hong's men flew out of the house. Some fell straight to the ground. Others hit the trees surrounding the property. Finally, the patriarch of the Hong family also flew out of the house. There was an arrow in his leg, and he could hardly get up from his knees. The owner of the house himself came out after them, inspecting the bodies scattered across the lawn. Adjusting his crossbow that he had just fought with, the boy snidely asked if this was all the Hong family was capable of. While Beiming was taunting the fighters right in front of him, the patriarch appeared. He looked at his enemy for a long time. From the house came the chomping of Snowball, who was happily dealing with the fighting spirits of his rivals. Beiming brought the crossbow to the patriarch's head, anticipating that in a moment the matter with the Hong family would be closed. Looking him in the eye, he said he didn't want to kill him originally, but since they were attacking his home and wanted to hurt his family, he had no choice. Anger, fury, and excitement filled the eyes of the guy, because before him was a real opportunity to show the other families who was now really strong. The old man had already prepared to die. He looked into the enemy's face, and fear and hatred radiated from him. Preparing to fire, an unidentifiable shadow hovered over the young man. Beiming looked around in an attempt to find his new hidden opponent. Suddenly, the tip of the stranger's weapon whistled a couple of centimeters away from him. Fleeing from the unexpected, the guy jumped back to a safe distance. An opponent appeared from the shadows. It was Hong Minu, Old Man Hong's nephew. The guy introduced himself and decided to give a reference about himself, saying that he was a disciple of an elder of the demon-slaying alliance and that he had come to avenge his cousin. Beiming looked at the guy in confusion because he couldn't remember anything about this alliance. Young Hong then advised his uncle to take cover so he wouldn't get caught in the showdown. But Beiming interrupted him and advised him to leave his house if he didn't want to end up just like his fighters. That sounded like a challenge to Minu. He looked at the boy with an assertive look, waiting for him to act. Beiming tried to figure out how he could have missed the enemy, and when he had managed to get so close. The hunter promised that he would let the boy live, because he had a power that could be useful somewhere else, and offered to join the Demon Extermination Alliance, and in return, he would release the Hong family's grudge against him. But Beiming was not interested in the old man's nephew's suggestion. He was doing just fine on his own. Minu took the guy's words as insults and lunged at the guy with the axe to attack. Another moment, and the weapon hit Beiming in the stomach. A trail of blood was left on the body of a guy who couldn't believe what was happening. Minu's eyes burned with fire, and he shouted that the enemy must die. The weather was beautiful in the city of Luona. The houses of the townspeople shimmered under the rays and let the sun bunnies fly. A girl stood on the wharf of one of the estates and looked pensively into the water. She was puzzled and was waiting impatiently for someone. It was Dongfang Zu. From her appearance, one could tell that she was worried about something. Footsteps were heard not far away from her, and she thought her sister Zoe had come. Qingxuan asked if she had done her errand, but all she heard in response was rude remarks against Beiming. She recounted what had happened and suggested that the ex-fiancé was now in the hands of the Hongs. But my sister didn't believe it and demanded details to understand the situation herself. Then she talked about how she had encountered Hong Minu and about him herself. Mentioned that he was incredibly talented and should be the Hong's receiver soon. In every detail, the sister recounted the events that had taken place and details of the guy's biography. After listening to her sister's story, Qingxuan said that she had to stop the Hong family, and to do so, she would turn to her father. His misunderstanding made Zuoyi angry. She didn't understand why her sister was so concerned about the fate of the guy who refused to be her fiancé. Out of anger, she reminded her that the engagement was broken, and that now Chen had nothing to do with them. Qingxuan then said that she was already Beiming's wife, since her grandfather had signed an agreement with the Chen family, and even her father couldn't stop it. She was sure that even at birth, her mission was predestined, and that mission was to become a member of the Chen family. Zoe only looked pitifully at her sister leaving, not fully believing the seriousness of her words. In Beiming's house, the battle continued. Minu saw that the boy was good at repelling attacks, but he was sure that it would not be enough for him to win, because he was sure of his absolute invincibility. Patriarch Hong watched the boys from the side. It was a surprise to him that his nephew had been opposing his enemy for so long. After all, the strength of the Demon Slayer Alliance apparently gave him invaluable experience in such battles. The old man's gaze fell on Beiming's weapon as he assessed the situation. It was legendary. The master of the house was trying to choose the best tactics that would lead him to his target. He looked at Minta standing not far from him, and was going over in his head everything he knew, as suddenly the guy remembered the ghost shadow technique. Minu lunged at his opponent. There was confidence in his eyes. He took a swing at the guy and wished him to go to hell already, anticipating his triumph. With a blow of his sword, he sliced the guy's body in half. Now it was all over. There was a triumphant laugh as Minu realized that it was he who could punish the young man for his insolence. But the triumph was short-lived, and Hong's eyes filled with anger as Beiming's body disappeared. The boy looked around and heard the voice of his opponent. Beiming stood before him, alive and unharmed. Minu didn't believe what was happening and thought it was just an illusion, because the guy couldn't have survived his blow. Without wasting any time for long deliberation, he pounced on his enemy again. He was now using the mountain destruction technique, which he felt should end the fight. But that wasn't enough for the guy, and he delivered a ground-shattering blow. Applause could be heard behind him. Mintu turned around and saw Beiming. He was standing there, alive and unharmed. The boy didn't understand how this could happen. The tactics had been chosen so that the enemy had no chance. Beiming stood opposite and noticed that the boy was not such a diligent student, since he had mastered only a part of the techniques that he could not fully perform. The words hurt Hong's ego, and he once again attempted his vicious strike. But Beiming continued to criticize his opponent, which confused him. Mintu's ego had already been trampled. With each phrase, he felt a new surge of anger, and now there was no way he could contain himself. One by one, he struck, but it was useless because he was only cutting through the air. Taking advantage of his opponent's blunder, Beiming swooped down on him, pulling out his dagger. Using the shadow slash technique, he severed the guy's arm from his body. What was happening seemed impossible to Mintu because he was sure of his victory. The people who had come with him, led by Patriarch Hong, gasped in horror as they saw the scene unfolding on the battlefield. Sweat ran down Mintu's face from the pain he was feeling, but he couldn't help but wonder how his enemy could become so strong so quickly. He kept complaining about the loss of his hand, and it was as if, even afterward, he didn't fully accept his loss. He promised that Beiming would pay for what he'd done with his life. The fighters supporting the old man at that moment tried to cheer him up. That one held on with all his might and promised them that he wouldn't let the Hong family's hope die. He realized that Beiming's power had only grown since the last meeting, and he could only deal with him by changing the course of events. At that moment, the window of the house opened, and a maiden figure appeared in it. Shuer looked out and was horrified. She pitifully called out to her brother. A plan for revenge instantly appeared in Hong's mind at the mere sight of the girl. He enthusiastically summoned his fighters to council and make an important decision. The old man was recounting his plan when Beiming noticed something amiss. Now it was his job to figure out what the Hongs were up to this time. Without wasting a moment, Mintu raised his weapon lying in a hand he would never be able to feel again. Clenching his teeth from the unbearable pain, he made a huge effort and rushed forward to attack. Beiming was stunned at what he saw, for the boy now had his hand in his teeth. Pushing off the ground and bringing his instrument of death, the enemy made his move. But the effort was in vain. He missed. Even that didn't stop him. He continued to swing his sword, hoping to at least accidentally snag his assailant. Beiming dodged his blows. He realized it was time to decide the fate of this battle. The guy started using his crossbow. The arrows flew straight at the enemy. After hitting his opponent, Beiming said he was obligated to finish him off because Hong wanted to harm him and his family. At this time, in parallel, the Patriarch was outlining in color the details of his evil plan. He ordered his fighters to capture Shuer to show her brother that you can't treat the Hong family like that. The army obediently nodded, memorizing the details and already imagining how they would achieve their goal, step by step. They walked into the house. The sound of their footsteps echoed throughout the mansion. The girl sitting in the upstairs room heard the approaching stomping. She tensed up. Senior Hong looked at his opponent with hatred in his eyes. He promised that he would definitely take him to hell with him now. His words made Beiming tense up. He held his dagger at the ready to repel a possible attack. But the battle continued. None of the fighters wanted to give up. Not even Mintu, who should have accepted the inevitable long ago. Even the arrows that hit him couldn't stop him. Something inhuman seemed to give him the inner strength to continue. Beiming didn't want to give up either, as he realized that his strength was many times superior, and therefore he had a better chance. After another attempted attack, the combat cut technique failed to produce any results. The fighters only distanced themselves one after another, and bided their time before new moves. Beiming tried to break Mintu's spirit and constantly reminded him that he didn't have long to live, because the guy was taking him straight to hell. A flash from the window of the house paused the battle. Everyone turned around, trying to figure out what had happened. Beiming looked at the window in horror and remembered that his sister and friend were in that very room. Senior Hong also didn't understand what was going on, even though he was the one who sent his fighters after the girl. Following the flash and the debris of the window frame, Shuer fell out of it. She was clutching her crane in her hands. Beiming rushed to her aid and caught her sister in a leap. She was senseless. Landing on the ground and holding the girl in his arms, he examined her, not realizing how he could help her. Gaoxian fell from the window next. He crashed onto the tiles with a thud, causing them to rise into the air. When he saw his friends, he held out his hand to them as if he wanted to say something. The brother shook Shuer and begged her to wake up, but the girl was in a deep sleep and did not answer the boy. The images of the past, when he had already lost his family, flashed through his mind. A wave of pain swept over the young man. With eyes full of tears, he looked at the girl and remembered his vow that he would always protect her. Streams of tears flowed down his cheeks and his voice trembled. Now he was determined to exterminate the entire Hong family. He fell to his knees and screamed loudly at the pain that was tearing him to pieces from the inside out. The Patriarch ducked as a wave of anger hit everything in its path. Now he realized that he had awakened a dormant volcano, and his name was Beiming Chen. The guy kept shouting and talking about revenge for his sister. Now it was clear that he would finish what he had started at any cost. He swung his blade at the Patriarch, who could hardly move from the surprise. But Mintu pushed his uncle away as if out of nowhere. He fended off the attack with his sword, and ordered his uncle off the battlefield on the promise that he'd end up here on his own. He lunged at Beiming in an attempt to keep his promise to his family. Senior Hong only had to obey Mintu's order and leave. They quickly began to leave. Led by the Patriarch, the fighters began to drag their feet in hopes of surviving. But Beiming spotted the escape attempt and rushed in pursuit of the fugitives. Mintu decided to use all the techniques he possessed. Among them were the mountain breaker and the earth-splitting punch. Beiming was taken aback. He waited to see if the enemy could use his strength to the maximum. Hong flew into the air and swung his sword. A flash of light illuminated the battlefield. He thought he was about to be dealt a decisive blow that would leave him victorious. But to Beiming's surprise, the opponent said they would end their confrontation next time. Brother Chen looked around. Only the pillars of dust reminded him that there had been a battle here not long ago. The guy was furious when he realized his opponents had escaped, but they didn't stand a chance because he was going to catch up with them. From behind, someone's voice was heard telling Beiming not to run after the enemies. It was Gaoxian. He asked the boy to stay with his sister and help her. He looked back and was surprised at himself, for he had forgotten about Shuya for a while out of rage and vengeance. He approached the girl and placed his palm on her forehead. Gaoxian watched his friend's movements carefully. His hand began to glow, and a warm beam came out towards Shuya, illuminating everything in its path. Gaoxian was concerned about what was happening, and he asked Beiming what he was trying to do. He told the guy that Shui would live and recover with high-level herbal treatment. Suddenly, Gaoxian became discouraged, and tears appeared in his eyes. He said that it was because of him that everything happened, because he was useless. But Beiming interrupted the boy's attack. He ordered Shui to be carried into the house, while he went to the black market to get the necessary herbs. Before leaving, the young man took his friend by the shoulder and told him that he was not guilty of anything, and that the real culprits would still receive their punishment. As a farewell, Beiming called Snowball over and ordered him to guard the grounds of the house and report any possible trouble. The fluffy lump began to bounce approvingly, happy that he was entrusted with such an important task. Gaoxian warned his friend and promised to take revenge on his abusers just as he had. Beiming nodded approvingly to the lad and began to retire with hurried steps. Darkness had already fallen over the city, and there was no trace of the sunny day. Beiming walked through the sparsely populated streets looking for something that could help his sister. He stopped at one of the shops and began to look at the goods lying in front of him and listened to the conversation between the seller and the buyer. The trader argued that the quality of his goods was top-notch, while his opponent asserted that such things could be found at every turn. Listening to the speech, Beiming didn't understand why no one was selling herbs and medicines because it was a black market. Someone in the back touched the guy and interrogated the guy about what exactly he was looking for. Beiming turned around and saw only a shadow. Not realizing who he was dealing with, he asked the stranger to introduce himself. The stranger said his name. His name was Gudao Changsheng. The guy knew absolutely everything about the black market. Beiming appraised the young man with a glance and asked him where the medicinal herbs were sold. Then the guy said he'd show us the way in exchange for a 10 grand payment. Beiming smiled and agreed. Changsheng nodded approvingly, and with a head movement, he invited his new friend to follow him. He pointed to one of the stores, saying that it was the place where Beiming could get what he needed. The young man was still surprised by the idea that it was hard to find medicinal herbs on the black market. On the way, Changsheng said that in any case, Beiming wouldn't have been able to find the store on his own. He kept up an unobtrusive conversation and talked about how lucky the guy was to have met him. Changsheng turned his head and asked the guy's name that he had originally forgotten to clarify. Beiming introduced himself and tensed up a little. The whole environment seemed unnatural and dangerous to him. Gudao tapped his hand with his fan and said that he could discern strength and power in his new friend's name. He remembered the legend of the Beiming monster. There was no response from the guy, and Changsheng asked him if he had heard of this legend. Beiming tensed. He doubted anyone in the neighborhood would know the legend, and the stranger's last name seemed new to him as well. But the wanderer assured that he was not a local, and here the fellow met him quite by chance. He boastfully put his hand up and said it would take a minimum of 7 days and nights to study the emo biography. He also took offense to the fact that his last name is Gudoa and not Gu, as Beiming had called him earlier. But the young man continued to be surprised by the carelessness with which the boy had reported the monster and the waters in which it was found. Looking at the laughing stranger, Beiming decided he should be more careful with him. The boys stopped. Now they had arrived at their destination. Beiming scrutinized the building that appeared in front of him. It was hardly visible under the cover of night. It was the Black House. There was a light coming from inside, but it was so pale that blackness seemed to fill the interior. Changsheng once again recalled that this was the only place where it was possible to buy medicinal herbs. He said that the Black House is spreading almost everywhere and is sometimes found even in very small neighborhoods. The traveler patted Beiming on the shoulder and reminded him of the 10,000 debt, saying that friendship without payment was worthless. Examining the guy again, he was now sure he was facing a high-level hunter. Beiming said he'd pay the guy anyway, even if he couldn't find the herbs he needed. Changsheng was surprised at the guy's calmness. He hadn't expected to meet someone like that in this neighborhood. He pointed to the entrance with his hand and motioned for his new friend to step inside. When the door opened, the travelers found themselves in a spacious room. On the racks were various goods that were almost impossible to find in free access. Changsheng beckoned his comrade to follow him, pointing somewhere in the distance of the store. But looking at the racks and examining the furnishings, Beiming's gaze lingered on a very interesting artifact. On one of the counters, he saw a dragon elephant tusk. 2 workers were moving it to the shelf above. Next, Beiming saw the feathers of a baby phoenix. They lay beneath the glass and reflected the artificial light of the store lights. The guy was surprised because he could not imagine that in such a godforsaken place could be such jewelry. His curiosity was interrupted by the voice of a wanderer who reminded him of the purpose of the black market visit. Beiming decided that the young man was only reminding him of this to get his promised money sooner. One of the store clerks approached the guests and asked what brought them here, mentioning that they could find anything here. Beiming then began to enumerate. He needed the spirit fruit of the 7 stars, bitter lotus Buddha, Holiocyan purple wisteria. Chang Sheng, who was standing next to him, was confused because he had never heard of such herbs before. The consultant quickly calculated the amount of the order and said that it would all come out to them in 160,000 coins. Beiming asked for the purchase to be made in duplicate, much to the delight of the store clerk. He offered the buyers to wait for him on the spot, while he hurriedly left to gather what he needed. The traveler assumed that the guy came from a big family since he could spend such a sum so easily. Beiming didn't like the subject brought up and brushed the guy off, saying it worked out to earn a little extra. A salesman appeared in the hall, carrying an order to the guys. As he passed by one of the racks and met the incoming man's gaze, his eyes fell on an interesting object. The unusual plant was on the shelf and did not yet imply that it might soon be purchased. Beiming couldn't take his eyes off him. He couldn't believe what was happening and stared in surprise. He immediately asked the counselor to show him the plant. Changsheng tensed up. This request seemed unusual to him, and the guy's reaction seemed strange. The vendor took out an item from the shelf and proudly presented it with a smile. It was a white jade bone that was worth 3,000 coins. Beiming's hands reached for the find. He could not believe that he had caught such a rare specimen for such a small sum of money. Holding the bone in his hands, he thought that if such an item were in a Star Alliance store, it would cost hundreds of times more. Beiming handed the bone to the salesman and said without hesitation that he would take it too. The consultant gave him a benevolent smile. The sudden joy was interrupted by a voice from behind. Someone was going to buy a bone ahead of Beiming. There was a strange couple standing in the doorway of the store, and the guy claimed he was buying it. The consultant decided to rectify the situation, and turning to the guest, said that Mr. Chen was the first, while calling the stranger by name. His name was Li. He strode slowly through the store, saying that he didn't care much and that he would get his hands on the precious find anyhow. Stopping near Beiming, the guy advised him to give the bone in peace, so he wouldn't have a problem. But Mr. Chen didn't want to give in. He remembered the saying about the early bird getting the worm. The angry Li shouted to the counselor and asked the price of the white jade bone. The seller shakily voiced a price tag of 3,000 coins. Li was confused. He hadn't expected such a low price for such a valuable find. He turned to his sister, who was standing nearby, and asked her if their master really needed a white jade bone. The girl looked angrily at her brother and rephrased the question, expecting the guy to realize the level of his stupidity. The frightened young man began to deny everything under the weight of his sister's gaze. Then he started making excuses that it was too low a price for a gift and that the master might be offended by them. The girl shut her brother up, saying he didn't understand. She gave him a look of contempt. Their father traveled to 3 big cities in search of the bone, and they only came here because they heard the news that the bone was here. Li's sister decided to take the situation into her own hands and offered Beiming to buy her back from him, but the girl was refused. Then she began to raise the price and offered 10,000. But Beiming realized that no amount of money would make him miss out on this find, so he continued to refuse. The bids grew, and then the price rose to 100,000 coins. Certainly the price was good for a bargain. Beiming didn't buy that either, because he needed the bone for himself. The boy was overjoyed to find it, and for such a price. He was sure that no amount of money could cover its usefulness in his life. Li was angry because he thought his sister's offer should bribe the guy. Now he offered to settle the matter the hard way, since it was not possible to reach an amicable agreement. He held out his hand and mockingly told Beiming that the white jade bone would belong to him. Beiming then handed the purchase to the vendor and asked him to save it, as he would be back for it soon. The guy turned to the Li family and caustically noted that they are only capable of violence if they don't get their way. The brother lunged at Beiming, shouting at him to shut his mouth and not dare to utter words against his family. Drawing his weapon, he swung it at the guy, showing the seriousness of his intentions. Beiming concentrated and quickly gathered himself for the upcoming battle. His task was first to discover the enemy's weaknesses. With one swipe of his dagger, he sliced his opponent's whip in half. Li couldn't believe his eyes. Now he was holding 2 pieces of what used to be his weapon. Looking at the dagger, he realized it was divine. Sister Li, who was not actively involved in the conflict, was also surprised at what was happening. Only Beiming was sure of his actions. Now he stood waiting for his opponent's next move. Standing behind him, Changsheng watched curiously. He realized that the observation tactic would be the most advantageous for him. Throwing the whip aside, Li refused to believe that his bone whip was ruined and could no longer be used in battle. Then he vowed to kill Beiming, and if he didn't, he'd take his own life. He summoned his fighting spirit and ordered the Blood Eagle to tear apart the enemy. Beiming was stunned by the surprise, for the enemy's actions were full of determination. But there was no time to be frightened. A bloody eagle flew at him, ready to do his master's bidding. In a swoop, the guy grabbed the bird by the throat, causing it to make loud, hoarse noises. Beiming smugly looked at Li and said that his fighting spirit was too weak to deal with him. In defense of the bird, rushed the owner himself, who seemed mad with anger. He yelled for the guy to let go of his fighting spirit that was still fluttering clutched in Beiming's hand. Seeing the attempted attack against him, the young man came up with a cunning plan to humiliate his enemy. He swung and struck his opponent with his own blood eagle, sending him flying several meters away. Li was consumed by rage. With every strike and every moment of the battle, he became more ferocious and hateful. With another punch, Beiming knocked the guy out. He landed on his knees and slid across the store, knocking everything in his path. Judging by Li's lying senseless, it was clear that the fight was not over in his favor. Sister Li was horrified when she saw this. Her eyes were filled with confusion and anger. His brother tried to make an effort to get up and finish the battle, but could only cough heavily and breathe intermittently after what had happened. Changsheng watched his every move in amazement. Now he realized that meeting Beiming had brought him more than just money. Li lay unconscious for a while, but then he gathered his strength and stood up. He still believed that he could take revenge, but he was stopped by his sister, who ordered him to shut up to avoid further trouble. This surprised the guy, and he had nothing to do but annoyedly run through the situation in his head. She calmly approached Beiming and kindly asked to release her brother's blood eagle, assuring that there was nothing wrong in this act. The boy could hardly believe her as he saw the claws approaching him. It was now the Li family's job to convince the young man to let go of his fighting spirit. Beiming didn't hesitate for a second and informed the couple that he wanted 10 million in compensation. The sister thought about it. In her heart of hearts, she realized that this was the safest way to settle the conflict, but the sum was great. But my brother couldn't resist such insolence. He advised him to let his eagle go, or else he would use his full force. Beiming quickly figured out the guy's pain point and kept pushing that. This way the bird wouldn't come back to him. He looked the frightened bird in the eye and sarcastically said that his master no longer needed him. Beiming sighed sympathetically and added that there was no point in letting the eagle live in such a case. His musings were interrupted by a shout from Li's sister ordering him to stop. But Beiming had already squeezed his hand at the neck of the bird she made her last sound and went to a better world. The brother and sister were stunned by what had happened. They hoped that it was not true and that the bird would wake up. But instead, her body fell to the floor of the store with a loud crash. There was a scream from Brother Li. Sister, on the other hand, lowered her eyes to the floor and began to say that Beiming had just killed a Supreme Court Martial spirit-level disciple beast. She took her gaze off the floor, fire now burning in it. It was clear that she wanted to repay the suffering she and her brother had caused. Beiming assessed the girl with a glance and decided that she belonged to a high-level hunter. When Changsheng heard about the Supreme Court, he was surprised. He didn't expect to meet such people on his way. There was a sudden sound, and everyone looked around trying to find the source. Clawed paws screeched as they pierced the store's parquet flooring. The beast's heavy breathing could be heard in every corner of the room. The beast approached Li's sister and bowed its head obediently before her, after which the girl promised Beiming that he wouldn't get out of here alive. The boy recognized the beast as a dark tiger lion. He had caused fear in almost all the witnesses of what was happening. Sister Li had snidely suggested that Beiming join the Blood Eagle on the journey to the other world. The vendors hid behind the racks. Now they were worried not so much for their goods as for their lives. On the battlefield remained Beiming's sister Li, her fighting spirit, and Changsheng, who seemed to be not at all frightened by the picture. The tiger lion's eyes were burning, and he waited patiently for the command of his belligerent mistress. Changsheng was attentive to detail. He looked at the image of the girl and formed a unified picture. In Li's sister, he recognized a high-level hunter. She was distinguished by her dark tiger and crescent moon earrings. Among other things, the family had mentioned their connection to the Supreme Court. Now, there could be no doubt. The memory that came over Changsheng knocked him out of his thoughts. He felt sick because he recognized the girl as the daughter of Supreme Court leader Lan Zhaoyue. Beiming was surprised by the wanderer's words. He had no idea who he was talking about. The girl noted with a smug smile that their pleas for forgiveness no longer mattered. She ordered the tiger lion to attack the enemies and tear them to shreds, reminding them to be careful as the dagger was a great danger. Hearing his mistress's command, the beast rushed to the attack, unaware of the power his opponent was hiding. Beiming didn't believe the demonic beast could actually harm or kill him. After all, it wasn't the first beast he'd dealt with. He bared his weapon and waited for the tiger lion to approach him to attack. With quick movements, the martial spirit reached the opponent who was already waiting for him for reprisal. But to Beiming's surprise, the beast managed to dodge the blow. This indicated its advanced intelligence. The surviving tiger lion was smashing the store windows. Salespeople and their assistants jumped out in terror and ran away in the hope of escaping. The beast was heading towards one of them. The poor man screamed and begged for help, for it was useless to run away. But the tiger lion had little interest in the salesman. His goal was to get Beiming's life. In turn, the guy began to take his opponent more seriously, because he was many times stronger than the fallen eagle. The battle was interrupted by a voice that urged to stop what was happening. The participants in the events caught a surprised pause, not realizing who dared to interrupt their showdown. Up the thresholds came an army of fighters, dressed in a uniform that looked like the clothes of salesmen. Changsheng covered himself with his fan and snidely remarked that the situation was heating up and it was only getting more interesting. A middle-aged man stood at the head of the squad. The soldiers parted to allow the commander to pass. It was the owner of the Black House. He was angry that the young men had decided to pick a fight in his store and ruin all his efforts. Frightened shopkeepers looked out from behind the shop windows, and it was unclear what they feared more than the owner's anger or a scuffle. The gentleman asked loudly who dared to do such a thing in his store. The consultant who was putting together the order for Beiming began to recount what was happening, with a voice shaking with nerves. He pointed at the guy and said he had come to buy medicinal herbs and a white jade bone. But then he pointed to Li and said he wanted the same product. The gentleman looked at the guy sternly and asked how he could make such a mess and damage his store so badly. Li started making excuses and saying he was just misunderstood. He complained that Beiming had killed his blood eagle. That was the real reason for the battle in the Black House. Li asked the ninth in command to be fair in his judgment, but he only looked at the guy angrily and said that his problem had nothing to do with the building of the Dark House. After a little thought, he gave his verdict. Li must pay tenfold for the damage he had done. Otherwise, he'll stay in this building forever, but unfortunately, not alive. As if hearing the command, the fighters pointed their weapons at the guys who seemed to have no intention of resisting. At least, not yet. Sister Li said that she was interested in the jade bone, and once she received it, she would reimburse her 100-fold. Hearing the hypothetical figure of the ninth commander was stunned, but in time gathered himself and said that he had enough tenfold. Li's brother agreed to pay 10 times as much, but also clarified whether the fighters would be able to take the money from him and his sister. This only made the commander laugh. After all, in front of him stood a young, inexperienced boy who would be foolish to fear. But Li mentioned the Supreme Court, which put the master of the Dark House in a stupor. He knew it would be costly to mess with them, as this organization was one of the 3 strongest in the city. The commander asked the young man what he had to do with the Supreme Court. Brother Li smiled wryly and said that something hadn't reached the shopkeeper yet since he didn't know the latest news. Introducing himself by his full name, Li Mo, he boasted that he had joined the Supreme Court 6 months ago, and his companion, who was his sister, was nothing short of a real gem of an organization. The ninth commander realized that Lan Zhaoyue herself was standing in front of him. He changed from anger to mercy in a moment and began to greet the princess of the Supreme Court in a friendly manner. But such attention disgusted the girl, and she said that she would take the jade bone, pay the loss 100-fold, and immediately leave. But unfortunately, Lan Zhaoyue, ninth commander, reminded that the item had already been sold, and thus no longer belonged to the Dark House. Li continued to pour oil on the fire, saying that the host was misinterpreting what his sister said. The boy's boldness surprised the old man, and he gave him a baleful look. The guy kept insisting that the white jade bone hadn't been sold yet. Changsheng and Beiming looked at each other. The advantages one by one crawled away from them. With a shout, the commander turned to the vendor to see if the bone had been sold or not. The clerk stammered and explained the situation, that together with the bone, the medicines were bought and prepared in the pantry. The payment was to be made all at once. The commander was terribly angry as he realized that he was now in a vulnerable position because, in fact, the bone had not been sold. The salesman shrank back from the fear he felt at the words of his superior. The ninth commander turned to Beiming and asked for the jade bone to be returned to him. The guy hadn't expected such a turn, so he sneered, pointing out the Dark House's incompetence in sales. But the chief was adamant. In reality, the methods of the Dark House leadership did not concern Beiming. He held out his hand in anticipation of the return of the goods that had caused these proceedings. The commander reminded him that his store had no business with the guy, so he had to comply. Looking at the old man, Beiming realized that he was also a high-level hunter. The boy voiced the conclusion that came first to his mind. The Dark House had obvious problems with customer service. But that didn't get the commander's attention. He continued to demand that the jade be returned and that the boy get out of his store. He also promised that the road to the Dark House was closed to him because he would never be sold anything here again. Beiming turned to Changsheng standing next to him and asked if he wanted to collaborate with him. The offer interested the guy and he asked for details. Beiming offered to destroy the Dark House, and for that he would pay the Wanderer 10 million. Surprised voices broke out behind their backs. Everyone thought the boy was crazy. The The commander also couldn't hide his emotions, so he rephrased the question again. Then he gave the lad a signal to act, for he believed with all his heart that Beiming's scheme could not be realized. After folding his fan, Chang Sheng laughed and told the young man that he was obviously not in his right mind to even think of such a thing, but then said in a quiet voice, with a smirk, that he was willing to go crazy with him for such a plan. Now he was on the few team to destroy the Dark House. The thought thrilled him. The 9th commander did not expect this development. Even more so, he didn't recognize the high-level hunter standing in front of him. Chang Sheng said he would take on the store owner, while Beiming himself would have to destroy the building itself. Chen rushed towards the soldiers, who were standing relaxedly, and did not expect such a swift attack. The old man gave the order to deal with the guy at any cost because his store was at stake. The batons of the fighters swung upward, cleaving the air. Now they were ready to repel the attack of a potential enemy. The soldiers tried to hit the guy with their weapons, but one by one they missed, causing the anger of the chief. They themselves did not expect such dexterity from a potential store customer who came to buy herbs. The 9th commander continued to hiss angrily at the guy and mutter insults to himself. When he saw that his opponent was getting away, he threw his dagger at him in an attempt to stop him. But the weapon was not destined to injure Beiming. Behind his back, the ball literally stopped and fell to the floor with a clatter. Apparently, Chang Sheng's fan had shattered the weapon, and now the advantage was on the guy's side. The 9th commander was surprised and froze. He had not expected that such a thing was even possible. Opening the fan, Chang Sheng turned to the old man with the words that he had chosen the wrong person to be his enemy. Now he himself would become an adversary to the old man. The boy gave the commander a mocking look. In turn, the latter could not budge and only stared at his ruined golden ghost raven chain. After all, it was hard to believe that such a gun could be destroyed by some fan. Chang Sheng walked over to the remains of the gun and picked it up. With a squeamish look, he called it unfit for such a battle. Going through the memories in his hands, he clarified with the commander why he was shaking on her like that. The Supreme Court princess, who had not previously participated in the battle, looked at Chang Sheng's fan with interest. She recognized it as a Mountain River fan. Now the girl was sure that the guy belonged to the Gu family, but her brother questioned her words, as he doubted how Shan Cheng's boyfriend would get into a neighborhood like Luohe. She looked at the guy appraisingly, and remembered that she had only heard unflattering things about him. People said he ran away from his home for some girl who apparently lived here. The brother kept insisting that it didn't matter to feud with the Gu family, since they wouldn't forgive them if they took the jade for themselves. But the princess was determined. She would not give up what she thought was rightfully hers to anyone. Finally, the 9th commander began to realize who his opponent was. The Gu family was both feared and respected by him. He found himself at a crossroads between two roads and could not choose one because on one side were representatives of the Supreme Court and on the other, Master Gu. He annoyingly realized that it was his job to stop the fight between them, because if it happened, there was nothing he could do. At this time, outside, Beiming began to realize his plan. He smashed the walls of the dark house, and his blows sent pieces of the walls flying in different directions. Chang Sheng came out to him and asked if he was done since it was already dinner time, but the guy suggested to his friend to take his time, and after finishing what he started, they would be happy to share a meal. But Chang Sheng continued to insist, because there were 5 stores in the dark house, and by the time the young man finished dinner time would have passed. The 9th commander stormed out of the store, pleading for Beiming to stop wreaking havoc in his store. But no sooner had he gotten close than Chang Sheng's fan touched his throat. He blocked the old man's path, making him even more confused. Ordering the commander to stay out of the way, he blocked his way with his fan, causing him to stand up like a stumbling block. Chang Sheng reminded him that if he dared to interfere in Beiming's affairs, he would bid farewell to his life. The commander was powerless in this situation. He stood and watched Beiming tear apart the walls of his store. Chang Sheng's threats were interrupted by Sister Li, who was smoothly approaching the guy still holding the old man in one place. She turned to the young man and told him that their families had never feuded, but that things could change if she didn't get what she came to the dark house for. But Chang Sheng only brushed off the princess, saying that he was his own master, and no one had authority over him, especially the 9th commander. He also reminded that it was not nice to use his father's name to get whatever came into the girl's head. Confident in his powers, he advised the couple to walk away from their dark house with nothing. The girl was furious. Such insolence could not leave her indifferent. The commander tried to calm the guest down, but the boy's next words prevented him from doing so. Na assessed the guy with a glance, and remembered that he was a level above her, and therefore they had no chance of winning the fight. Then she decided to pressure the old man, in whose power it was to give her the white jade bone. He instantly found an excuse, saying that he was afraid for his life, which could be taken away by Gu's family if he went against him. Then the princess said that if you kill Gu Dao, the old man can claim his seat in the Supreme Court. The commander was stunned by the girl's words. In fact, she had just offered him the position of vice leader. He coughed and thought quickly, and decided that he should take the bull by the horns when the opportunity arose. Turning to the girl, he asked her once more about the seriousness of such words. The princess promised that the commander would get the position once he killed Gudao and returned the white jade bone to her. The old man could hardly believe his guest's words, but the prospect of rising from an ordinary shopkeeper to the supreme court beckoned him. Chang Sheng watched their sweet conversation intently. His fan was at the ready as if he knew how things would unfold. The commander turned to the guards and ordered the beast mount to be released immediately. Hearing this, Beiming interrupted from his occupation and began to scrutinize what was happening. The fighters rushed past Chang Sheng, causing the guy to look surprised and confused. He tried to remember what a beast mountain was and how to fight it. The enraged and gambling commander turned to the boys and promised that no one would leave the dark house today. Chang Sheng marveled at the courage of the old man, who not long ago had been babbling in terror of himself and assured that he did not want to say goodbye to life. Beiming appeared out of nowhere and prepared to attack the 9th commander. Even Chang Sheng himself didn't expect this from his friend. The old man stood like a stumbling block. There was a look of surprise on his face, but an inner voice reminded him why he had started this battle. The girl's hand reached out and grabbed the man's shoulder. It was salvation for him, for Beiming would have killed him. In a commanding voice, she ordered the commander to stay out of the way. Together with the princess, the lion tiger was waiting for the command. Beiming was annoyed by the interference. He realized that he was very close to his goal when the girl interrupted him. The tiger lion swooped down beside the boy. It looked like the beast was experiencing the same feelings that the young man had a few moments ago. They looked at the beast, for it was now the main opponent of Beiming. The boy glared angrily at the girl's fighting spirit. He was going to deal with it the same way he had dealt with other demonic beasts. The owner of the lion tiger watched the battle with a smile. Behind her hid the 9th commander, who had once been famous for his bravery. He was glad to have such powerful patrons, and in order not to appear completely useless, he shouted insults at the boys. Beiming laughed, for he knew that the high court would not be able to hide a useless old man. He had his crossbow at the ready. Arrows flew towards the guy's enemies, and mentally he was already prepared to celebrate victory. But a sliver of light intercepted the fired weapons and reflected them back to Beiming's surprise. He was trying to figure out where the ribbon came from. When he looked around, he saw the princess. She was holding the same ribbon. She sternly told the guy that she wouldn't let him kill her pet. Chang Sheng took a closer look at the ribbon and recognized it as silk ice cloth. The young man warned that it was a holy weapon that even his fan might not be able to handle. Under the cover of night and the light of the stars in the dark house continued the battle, the outcome of which was unpredictable. Dust began to fall from the ceiling, and the building itself began to stagger. Brother Li tensed up from not understanding what was going on. He stared at the shaking floor and walls in a daze. Chang Sheng also shuddered in surprise. The guy assumed that an earthquake was starting. But Beiming knew the answer to the question. These sounds and what was happening in general was like a beast mountain. It was a terrifying mountain. Legend has it that all sorts of spirit beasts dwelt within it. Away from the dark house, people strolled leisurely down the street. Some were returning from work, others were coming from the store. The alleys were crowded. Some passers-by noticed a mountain appearing out of nowhere. They explained it by the fact that everything was happening to the side of a dark house. As the boys continued to look at each other, they felt tremors coming from the sidewalk. Everything pointed to an earthquake. The news of the animal's grief also caught Snowball. He was watching from the house and was ready to rush to his master. Clenching his furry fists, he decided that Beiming couldn't do it without him and rushed to his aid. The scary sounds amused the 9th commander, who was laughing loudly and rejoicing as if he had won the lottery. In between bursts of laughter, he assured that the now released Beast Mountain would surely deal with the guys. Chang Sheng had not heard of such a phenomenon before and asked his friend if it was true that there were spirit beasts dwelling inside the mountain in unprecedented numbers. Beiming nodded and asked his friend to be careful as the aura became more and more intense. Now Chang Sheng was frightened because he thought that such beasts would have no problem dealing with them. But his friend reassured him. Then the young man covered his face with his fan and waited for the arrival of the one whom everyone feared. A whistle appeared in the hands of the 9th commander. He showed it to everyone present. Then the old man turned to the boys and said that at his signal, the spirits would destroy them. Without a second's hesitation, the man put the whistle to his lips, and a deafening sound was heard. The boys looked at each other. Now, they were looking forward to what would happen next. The mountain creaked and began to emit a wheezing sound in which the voices of various beasts were guessed. Beiming ordered Chang Sheng to take the whistle from the old man at any cost while he himself dealt with the mountain. The boy agreed. With a sweep of his hand, he opened the fan. Now it was in all its glory, but it was dangerous, for the weapon was ready for battle. In an effort to save time and help his friend, the guy cut an exit in the wall so that his friend would sooner proceed with his part of the plan. A fireball seemed to fly out from the wall of the dark house, which instantly pierced the passage for Beiming. From surprise, the employees fell down, trying not to get under the guy's hot hand. Beiming accelerated and flew out through the passageway that Chang Sheng had kindly created. Lastly, he shouted that now he must deal with the building of the dark house. Overcoming the obstacles one by one, the guy headed towards the Beast Mountain, which was already quite close. Chang Sheng waved at the guy and gave him an approving smile as he said goodbye. The 9th commander snuck up on the guy and began to assure him that they wouldn't be able to destroy the mountain because they were too young and inexperienced. But Chang Sheng recommended that he take care of himself first. He turned to the old man again and demanded that he give him the whistle, or else he would send him to the other world. Behind the commander's back stood his men who were ready to defend their superior. Chang Sheng didn't expect anyone to want to fight him. He knew that, in a battle with him, the advantage would be on his side. Parallel to the events of the Dark House, Beiming made his way to the Beast Mountain. Monsters began to emerge from it, ready to tear the guy to shreds. But Beiming boldly struck with his dagger because he had no fear. In the Dark House, the 9th commander tried his best to keep the whistle, so he ordered his troops to protect it. Those obediently bowed their heads and prepared to do his bidding. Judging from Chang Sheng's face, he didn't plan to delay and was now going to take the commander's life and take the whistle. Beiming advanced inside the Beast Mountain. Along the way, he met all sorts of animals that he could handle without any problems. A fearsome shadow appeared behind the boy's back. It hissed and was more terrifying than those who had dwelt in the beginning. Beiming turned around, trying hard to see who was waiting for him in the darkness. Before he could see his opponent, dozens of claws pounced on him, ready to grab and tear the young man apart. But without a second's hesitation, the boy swung his dagger and chopped the monster to pieces. Danger awaited Beiming at every turn, and the deeper he went, the more careful he had to be. Ob turned around, took a breath, and started to move on as he heard the sound of breathing. Demonic wolves were coming at him from the depths. Their eyes glowed in the darkness, making them even more terrifying and warlike. Upon noticing Beiming, they roared, and the entire pack began to immediately prepare to defend their domain. But the boy was sure the animals would bring him more trouble than danger. He attacked the wolves first, and using his dagger and crossbow quickly dealt with the animals. There was no end to the beasts, though he remembered bigger mountains in his memory. It pissed the guy off. The flying needles were headed straight for the relaxed but still pissed off guy. He jumped away from where they were about to hit. It kept him alive. Beiming looked up from where the buzzing sound was coming from. There were poisonous carnivorous bees staring at him, ready to attack. There was a whistling sound, and the boy realized that there was someone else in the cave. And it was someone who didn't want to do him any good. A shadow and loud heavy footsteps appeared behind the boy's back. It had to be recognized that Beiming was surrounded. Hell wolves came out of the darkness. Their eyes burned with fire, and their teeth were so big they would tear anyone apart. Without wasting a moment, the wasps continued their attack. They launched their stingers, trying to hit the guy and destroy him, but he managed to dodge. Beiming decided that the insects would wait, and the wolf needed to be dealt with first. Using a dagger, he inflicted a wound on the animal from which blood was already pouring. But before he could kill the monster, dozens of new eyes began to appear from the darkness. There seemed to be no end to it. Beiming tried with all his might to think of what to do to stop the beasts. He remembered the friend left behind in the dark house and thought he could use him now. Chang Sheng's fan dripped blood belonging to the fighters who had stood up to defend the 9th commander. He looked down at the fan and was disappointed that it was soiled. This could have been avoided if the old man had blown the whistle. The commander's mind was in chaos, because of which he could not put his thoughts together and decide how to proceed. Chang Sheng advised him to hurry up since the guy had unfinished business. But the commander was more cooperative now. He was trying to negotiate with the guy to save his life. At the suggestion to forget the conflict, the young man could not contain his laughter because everything had gone too far. Suddenly, his laughter turned rude, and Chang Sheng thought there was a hidden threat in it. He looked him in the eyes and said that the visit to Luo, he would be useless if he didn't destroy the dark house, then reached out and lunged at the commander to retrieve the whistle. The frightened old man clutched the thing to himself as if it were the greatest jewel in this world. But towards the guy flew a ribbon of princess, urging him not to be so brazen. He opened his fan and deftly deflected the blow. The ribbon couldn't hurt him now. He took advantage of the moment to strike the commander, which sent him flying off to the side. The old man's hand unclenched, and the cherished whistle that Chang Sheng wanted so badly flew out. The young man grabbed the item and advised the man not to hide behind the backs of the monsters because they would not be able to protect him. The commander, however, continued to threaten, saying that taking the whistle would get the consequences of the dark house nowhere. But that didn't stop the guy. He twirled the whistle in his hands and ostentatiously showed it to the audience, demonstrating his victory. After he examined the whistle and decided that if you blow it once, nothing bad would happen and everything would be fine. Chang Sheng brought the trophy to his lips and blew. There was a loud whistle that didn't sound like an ordinary whistle. Something strange began to happen to the young man. He was momentarily exhausted and bent over. His body stopped listening to the orders of his brain. The guy had never experienced that before. It was as if this whistling had sucked out all his senses and only his bodily shell was left. He stared helplessly at the object and didn't realize what he had done wrong since this had happened to him. The ripping laughter of the 9th commander sounded behind him. The 9th commander seemed to be deliberately pushing for what had happened. In an attempt to explain what was happening, the guy turned to the old man. He demanded an explanation. The joyous commander was saying that the dark house whistle was not as easy to use as the young man thought it was. Now he was doomed. Changsheng couldn't believe his words, but he couldn't find anything to say either. Sweat trickled down his face. Something incomprehensible began to happen on the Beast Mountain as well. The rocks shook and rumbled. The wolves were growing fiercer before my eyes. The fury in them was growing incredibly fast. Baimig immediately realized that it was all the fault of the whistling sound. The spirit beasts were becoming berserk. At this time, a silhouette appeared on the roof of the black house. It belonged to a young girl. She had a short haircut and a long cloak fluttering in the wind. Changsheng gathered his will into a fist and moved towards the commander who was already celebrating his victory. He kicked him and demanded an explanation of what was happening to him. But the commander didn't give up his victory. He insisted that the guy would die, and it was too late to do anything about it. All spirit beasts were to become berserks and could only be stopped by taking their lives. They were no longer subject to commands, so they were free to do whatever they saw fit. At this time in the cave, Baiming was dodging the omnipresent wrath of the monsters. But he did not lose heart and continued to fight. Now he could count on himself and his weapons. After a short fight, he still managed to take down the Hellwolf, and now it couldn't interfere with him. The poison wasps were still waiting for the boy. It seemed that they themselves gave him time to deal with the wolf. But there was no pity for them. Beaming pointed his crossbow at the monsters, and arrows flew one after another hitting the opponents. But at every turn, new monsters awaited the guy, including the recurring dead. Beaming realized that if things continued like this, he wouldn't be able to reach the heart of the mountain, and thus wouldn't be able to stop what was happening. Just then, the guy remembered about Snowball, who he left at home to guard his friend and his sister. Rocks fell from the rock face. It felt like a new wave of earthquake. Beaming raised his head, but the boy was not frightened, surprisingly. There was confidence in his eyes. The vault collapsed, and the boy fell over in surprise. He coughed and tried to catch his breath from the dust that filled the cave. A familiar sound came from the pile of rocks. There was no doubt that Snowball had come to the rescue, and he had done it in a very spectacular way. Beaming was damn glad that Fluffy heard his cry for help and came to him immediately. And the animal himself did not hide his emotions from the reunion with his master. Now they will deal with all attacks together and do it many times faster. But strange sounds kept coming from the pile of stones. There was no doubt that someone was there. Beaming tensed up and took a waiting stance. Just in case, he kept his weapon at the ready and could attack the enemy. A hissing sound came from the pile of rocks, and then the reptilian skin showed. Very quickly, it reached the boy, and now there was a spotted python in front of them. But the boy and Snowy were not upset by the appearance of the snake. They proudly decided that they would deal with the reptile together. In the dark building, the battle continued. But it seemed that the worst had already happened. The 9th commander threatened the guy that if he killed him, the dark building would avenge him. Changsheng didn't believe it. Then he decided to ask for help from Princess Lan, who was silently watching what was happening. She was surprised that the old man was asking for her help after she had made him such a generous offer. But she didn't refuse. The girl called out to the boy and ordered him to stop. Her voice was loud and confident. Seeing no reaction, she decided to use her tape. But the guy was professionally fending off her weapon attacks with his fan. Basically, they kept smashing up the store. What's left of it? Changsheng saw the cut on his cheek. He brushed the blood off the cut and turned to the girl. The boy decided that this was her way of challenging her to a battle. The young man decided to accept. The young lady had a belligerent attitude. Her eyes glistened with excitement and her lips spread into a smile. It was about to be a huge battle as suddenly an unknown voice was heard commanding to stop the battle. Lan glanced around the room with the thought that she would have to deal with more than just Changshen, who did the same thing while spreading his fan. There was a girl coming down the surviving stairs of the store. Her name was Mei Yu Zhou. She looked around the dilapidated room and only snorted. There was silence. The representatives of the Supreme Court also gave the guest evil looks. Li was surprised. He thought that Black Widow had left the city. The princess turned to her companion and was also surprised by the girl's visit. Brother Li warned his sister to be careful, as there were rumors of Widow being a heretic. He continued his legend by telling that a few years ago, a martial master-level spirit had left Luo He because of her appearance. These words made Lan think. Now, hasty decisions could lead to terrible consequences. The 9th commander froze, bowed his head, and began to stammer as the head of the dark house stood before him. Yuzhou stopped and sternly asked the old man about the situation. Although looking at what was happening, she didn't expect a soothing answer. The man fell to the floor and began to bow while recounting what had happened and explaining what the beast mount had been released for. The Dark Widow listened to the story and decided that the guys are just crazy to think that they can sow panic in her domain. Her eyes narrowed, and she turned to ask those present what had motivated them to do this deed. The girl's aura began to emit light. The people around her were shocked because they had never seen such a thing before. Changsheng was the only one who wasn't impressed by the sight of the dark house mistress. He laughed. The widow shook her head and searched for where that insolent laughter was coming from. He told the girl his name and smiled a smile similar to that of a not-so-welcome new acquaintance. Her heels clattered on the stairs, and she started to walk down to the guy. When she called his name, she recognized him as the young master of the Gu family. Chang Sheng smiled and hummed. He still covered himself with the fan, holding it at the ready. He complimented the girl, saying that the rumors of her unearthly beauty were not at all exaggerated. The girl let his words pass her ears and continued to insist that even a guy like him wasn't allowed to do such a thing. She believed that because of the Gu family's influence, her dark house was not worth a dime in his eyes. The boy ordered her to stop talking over him. The boy ordered her to stop talking to him. The ninth commander watched nervously and prayed that the madam's anger would not reach him. Chang Sheng continued to communicate with Dark Widow in her own manner. He caustically remarked that the Dark House was in the business of disciplining customers, and pointing to the representatives of the highest court, added that they can't make noise to restore justice. There was the sound of a cane hitting the floor. Everyone froze, waiting for a new participant in the conflict. Elder Zhang objected, asking when it was the Dark House that treated customers unfairly. His companion caustically remarked that in this way Mr. Gu was only trying to justify himself. The guy only smiled sweetly and laughed in response to such statements. The elder became angry. Such behavior was unacceptable to him. Tapping his fan against his hand, Chang Sheng pointed towards the workers, suggesting they give details of what had happened. The ninth commander tensed up. At that moment, he prayed that the guy wouldn't point at him, but unfortunately for him, things had turned against him. The boy stooped down to the old man and began to threaten him that if anything happened to Beiming, he'd have his head on straight. The commander tensed up and stared at Chang Sheng, who was speaking. In his heart, he hoped that he was dreaming. The angry Dark Widow immediately demanded an explanation from the man whose mind was busy making up a plausible story where he wasn't at fault. He began to shout that he was innocent, which gave himself away. The head now insisted on telling the details of the crime. The commander looked around. He realized that he was sinking deeper and deeper. He tried his best to find a way to save himself. The princess, who did not interfere with the dialogue, caught his eye. It seemed that she was not going to defend the insolent man either. The old man had no hope left and decided to tell the truth, that the guys came to buy medicine and saw the bone and wanted to buy it. He pointed at the princess and said that she also wanted the jade bone. But since the payment had not yet passed, the commander decided to give the goods to Mrs. Lan. The elders looked at each other, for now the situation did not seem so simple to them. Looking at Chang Sheng, the commander added that the guys decided to tear the Dark House apart out of their anger. The elder frowned. He felt that such actions were unnecessary, even for a member of the Gu family. Dark Widow smiled and named both parties to the conflict as the main forces of the city. She felt that the white jade bone wasn't worth all this conflict, much less such consequences. Lan intervened in the conversation. The girl promised to pay for all the damage she had done, as long as the bone was hers. The head heard the young lady's suggestion and turned to Chang Sheng, wondering what he had to offer. Gu thought that the widow's approving look meant that she sided with the Supreme Court and then recounted his vision. Then the head decided that Chang Sheng was not in the right to represent Beiming for him. It made the guy angry because he was so selflessly defending his newly acquired brother. The Beast Mountain problem didn't evaporate anywhere, and Widow demanded a whistle from the commander. But the man pointed his finger at Shu and complained that the latter had unceremoniously taken him away. The elders were shocked because they couldn't believe how this simpleton could let the whistle from the Spirit Mountain get to someone else. The widow approached Gu and asked for the item to be returned, as it was a special value of the Dark House. Chang Sheng immediately realized the advantageousness of his position and decided to give an ultimatum that he would return the whistle in exchange for his friend. But that was ruled out since Beiming's return depended on the Gu trophy. There was nothing left to do but agree to the arrangement. He handed the thing to the Dark Widow. She, in turn, made a promise that she would help save his friend. The widow's hand slid to take the item for himself, but something stopped Gu, and he was in no hurry to hand it over. His doubts were interrupted by a voice commanding him to stop immediately. The girl hovered in silence, and only her eyes searched for the man who dared to stop her. A silhouette appeared in the hole in the wall. It was Beiming, and Snowball sat obediently on his shoulder. He was happily nibbling on his prey brought from the Beast Mountain and smiling contentedly. Chang Sheng was incredibly happy about the appearance of his friends and wanted to believe that this joy was not because of the money he was expecting from the guy. The princess and her brother froze. They did not expect to see Beiming again, for they thought he would not return from his journey. The ninth commander was also surprised, as he thought that there was no turning back from the bowels of the Beast Mountain. Black Widow realized from the looks on his face that the guy was the Beiming who had unleashed the whole conflict. Chang Sheng was literally glowing with happiness. He himself could hardly believe that the boy would be able to save himself. But now the danger was over, and his friend was close by. Beiming grinned and said that the monsters wouldn't be able to stop him in any way. Mr. Gu shook his whistle almost in front of Black Widow's nose and boldly declared that their deal was no longer worthwhile. Beiming turned to his friend. He had important information he was eager to share. He told of his adventures on the mountain and said that the spirits could help them accomplish their goals if they could train them. The lad's narrative was interrupted by an indignant shriek from the head of the dark house. She shouted for the young man not to dare take the Beast Mountain for himself, since it was created by the main building and was very valuable to them. The widow held out her hand and demanded the whistle back, and in return, she would forget all the inconvenience it had caused. The princess did her part too. She added that if they gave her the jade bone, the Supreme Court would be indebted to them. Chang Sheng found all these suggestions attractive and asked his friend what they should do, but he only glared angrily at the ladies. The mention that the Supreme Court might owe someone something was laughable. Beiming shifted his gaze to the girl and called her Jian Yuzhou. This was not how he had pictured the head of the dark house in his head. The elders tensed and looked questioningly at the dark widow. The Supreme Court was also surprised. No one understood who Jian Yuzhou was. The young lady looked at the guy angrily and immediately demanded an explanation of who he was and what clan he belonged to. Without a shadow of a doubt, the guy introduced himself by his first and last name while stating his place of birth. The widow repeated his name, trying to remember if she had met this young man before. She remembered the story of how the Luon hunters had been beaten by someone with the same name. She was also worried about how he could know about Jian Yuzhou. It seemed to be some kind of terrible secret. Beiming cast a glance at her and asked the girl if she really wanted to talk about this now. In response, she only remained silent and stared at the floor as if some pictures of the past were flashing past her. After a moment's pause, she turned to the elder and ordered him not to let anyone out of the dark house. He nodded obediently and assured her that no one would be able to get past him, which meant that all participants would remain in their seats. The lady now turned to Beiming and warned him against deception, for otherwise she would have to take action. Her voice was commanding and clear. There was no embarrassment or pity in it. It was in that tone that she invited Beiming to follow her. The boy agreed without a doubt, with a chuckle. He was aware of his advantage, because he knew something that was hidden behind 7 seals. Chang Sheng cautioned his friend and advised him to be on the alert, as it could all be a trap. But Beiming gave Mr. Gu an approving look and patted his shoulder as if accepting his concerns. He asked his friend to trust him. His look gave hope to his comrade's heart. But he had his doubts about the men of the Supreme Court. Anything could be expected from them, so Beiming asked him to keep an eye on them. The princess overheard their conversation and seemed annoyed by the guy's words. Li watched and assessed the situation. Turning to his sister, he shared with her his conclusion that Beiming knew some secret of the Black Widow. So if this information combines them, the Supreme Court's advantage goes nowhere. But Lan was confident in her immunity because Aloy would be afraid to mess with her. Looking at his sister, Li was overcome with questions. He didn't understand what the name meant or why the lady had agreed to talk to him. The princess smiled slyly. The princess was smiling slyly, and a plan was brewing in her head to get what she wanted and get out unharmed. Beiming and the Dark Widow left the building. Now the extra ears remained inside, and their conversation was confidential. The guy said he knew a lot about the girl's family and named her Jiang, and he added that all the information pertained to his past life. He was confused for a moment, trying to see if it would match. The girl looked away and quietly asked how he knew all this, and clarified who could tell about it. The conversation was serious, and she promised to kill Beiming if he tried to lie to her. Leaning on the railing of the dark house, the lad began his narrative. He claimed that it didn't matter how he knew everything, but that the only person who could help her was standing in front of her. The girl made a surprised look, as if she didn't know what the young man was talking about, but behind the feigned look, she read fear. She lambasted the guy, saying that even his past merits didn't add points to him in her eyes. To her, he was just as worthless as the rest of them. She asked about his skills and how he could help her. There was a rustling sound like wings behind her. The eagle-like birds approached the dark house and waited for a command unknown to anyone. Dark Widow was sick of talking to the guy without any specifics, but she kept demanding details. Beiming looked down, crossed his arms on his chest, and said one name, Jiang Yufan. The girl felt as if she had been electrocuted. She couldn't believe her ears. The name had stirred up a storm of emotions. Then Beiming repeated the name and added that he knew all about him. His voice was calm and confident. The young lady spoke the name again. It was unequivocally familiar to her. Now she was desperately trying to cope with the wave of memories. Seeing the violent reaction, Beiming said he knew where to find someone with that name and what to do with her innate poison. The fiery dart fell out of the girl's hand and bounced off the balcony tiles with a clang. Dark Widow scrambled to her feet and grabbed her face. She no longer had the strength to deal with her emotions. Beiming continued. He said that her brother's family was unrivaled among her own kind. They were obscenely rich and envied by the people around them. The remnants of self-control left the girl, and she began to beg the young man to tell her where her brother was. The information was disappointing to Madame. She learned that the Jiang clan had sold him to the Celestial Alliance. Mei Yu Rong queried. She had never heard of what it was or where it was located before. Beiming began to explain that it was an unrivaled force located in impenetrable terrain and surrounded by monsters and Amaprian hunters. Among other things, the Celestial Alliance was guarded by an army of knights that made up a full-fledged army. The girl listened to the story with regret. Her brother was in the zone of inaccessibility, surrounded by terrible forces. She couldn't fully believe what she'd been told, but the more Beaming told her, the less faith she would have. The disbelief confused the guy, and he warned that he couldn't help if Black Widow couldn't believe him. She clenched her fists, and the tension around her rose. She realized that it prevented her from seeing her brother again. It made her tears flow. Beaming reassured the girl and reminded her that he had a real opportunity to help her grief. She flung back the hand he'd placed on her shoulder a moment ago and angrily asked how the guy was going to do it. Tears continued to pour from her beautiful eyes, and in every color, she imagined what a horrible place Yufan was in. Beaming tried to reassure her and reminded her that no one should know about her brother's origins, especially the Celestial Alliance. Mistress tried with all her might to believe that her brother could not be harmed. It seemed now that Beaming had succeeded in getting through to the girl, but instead of thanking her, she warned him against trying to deceive her. The guy realized that he had grabbed Luck by the tail and advised the head of the Black House to hurry up with the herbs, since she wasn't the only one who needed his help. She had no choice but to agree, for the saving straw was right in front of her. Heavy footsteps were heard below. A crowd of people was approaching the dilapidated building of the Dark House. Mei Yuzhou looked out over the railing and surveyed the surroundings, trying to see the uninvited guests. At the head of the group was a young boy. She recognized him as Liao Erjiang. The girl took a closer look and remembered that this wasn't the first time the guy had visited her store. He had already been here on behalf of the Central Pagoda. He had an excellent record that would be the envy of many. Mistress was sure that the guest had long ago left the city with his family, and the time for the financial check had not yet come. Assessing the approaching guests, Beaming concluded that they did not come here with good intentions. Looking at Mei, he insisted that he would go with her because the people of the Central Pagoda had a bad reputation in the city. Beaming and Dark Widow returned to the store building. The girl took another look at the damage done. Inside, an uninvited guest was already waiting for them, and those present gave him an appraising look. He stood behind the Supreme Court Princess's back, but she paid no attention to him. Mei turned to Beaming to warn him because Liao Erjiang was incredibly strong. Dark Widow began her dialogue by saying that it is very early for the financial inspection, and therefore the purpose of the visit is unclear. The man smiled slyly and squinted his eyes, stating that he could come for more than just a checkup. Mei then offered to show the merchandise and advise the guest if they actually came to shop. But she threatened that if he brought trouble, she would have to take action. At this point, the tension between them increased dramatically. The representatives of the Supreme Court immediately realized that Liao Erjiang held a grudge against Black Widow. The princess remembered that there was a reason for this. Many years ago, Liao's younger brother had fallen from the clutches of the Black Widow monster. A huge bird flew into the store building. It perched on the railing and made a loud noise as if to announce its arrival. Liao smiled his most insincere smile and informed that he didn't come for trouble, then squinted his eyes and asked about the white jade bone that was sold in the Black House. That amused the girl. She said that she would love to sell it to such an important client, but there was one thing, and it was but that the goods had already been purchased. She gestured to Beaming standing next to her. Everyone was surprised, and especially Cheng. He looked at his friend and mentally sent him the questions that appeared in his mind. He snuck up on the guy and asked what was up with Dark Widow since she made that decision. The man was called out by Lan. She turned to Liao, reminding him of her presence and the fact that she too had come here for the bone. But the uncle answered her that he had known the master for many years for whom the gift was intended, and that there was nothing he would not do for him. Liao turned to Mei, saying that he had no more questions for her since the goods had already been sold. After all, the Dark House was no longer responsible for it. He looked at Beaming and ordered him to hand over the white jade bone before the end of the day, or else death awaited him. Cheng entered the dialogue. He lamented that the Central Pagoda was treating customers like this and asked if Liao was Lan's biological father. This instantly aroused the man's anger. He was furious at the insolence. Lan didn't stand by either and advised Gu to hold his tongue to avoid repercussions. This seemed to be the reaction Cheng wanted. He intended to find out if the young princess was threatening him, at the same time demonstratively opening the fan and as if reminding of his power to all present. Liao took a closer look at the guy and quite by accident recognized him as a member of the Gu family for whom he had unprecedented respect. He bowed his head to the young master and with downcast eyes said with embarrassment that he didn't recognize the guy. The man stammered and excused himself. It would be the height of foolishness to conflict with such a force. But he was interrupted by Lan, who said that he should not make excuses or be afraid, as the Supreme Court would give him strength due to family ties. Cheng covered his face with a fan and observed the picture with one eye. Liao was touched by the girl's statement, because if she was to be believed, his reinforcements were just around the corner. Just in case, he quizzed his niece on the seriousness of her words. He wanted to be 100% sure of her support. Then the man's confused face changed. In its place was the eagle-eyed, cunning look with which he had entered the store originally. Mustering up his courage, he replied to Gu that the matter was none of his business, and right now it was all internal friction in the dark house. But Chang Sheng thought the man was cooperating with the Supreme Court since he decided to threaten him again. Beiming coughed, wishing with this gesture to recall his presence and direct involvement in this conflict. Gu turned to the man and asked if he was the head of the Liao clan. Erjiang was flattered by this assumption, but nevertheless decided to clarify the situation. Some of their family wanted to attend the wedding celebrations of others and had to present a white jade bone as a gift. But the guy countered this argument by saying that the Hong family, who were having a party, couldn't be offended if they knew that the gift had been stolen from the Black House. But Liao squinted his eyes and advised him not to say that. He always changed his gaze when he threatened. Beiming couldn't stay away anymore, and reminded that he had acquired the white jade bone and not stolen it like everyone thought. And besides, it was clear that Hong's surname had been used on purpose by them since they knew about the past conflict with them. The man didn't fully understand what moved the boy daring boldness or stupidity. Chang Sheng was amused by the fact that Liao was bolder after hearing about the Supreme Court's support. Beiming offered him a fight to make things fair. The boy smiled in anticipation of another fight and tossed caustic expressions at the man to get him emotional. The final straw was that Beiming refused to be a servant for the man and give him the bone. Such humiliation Liao could not endure being a first-class employee of the Central Pagoda. His voice turned commanding, and he ordered his fighters to immediately deal with the young man and get the jade. But the Black Widow stopped the approaching warriors with a single glance, with a sudden gust of wind. He paralyzed his subordinates, and they tried to escape by covering each other. But it didn't work. Liao turned to Mei, who seemed to be playing with his troops. He glanced at her questioningly, ordering her to stop. But the girl said she wouldn't let them damage the store because it was her property, which meant they'd have to deal with her. Arrogating his authority, he decided to threaten Mei, reminding her that he was an authority figure and her actions could be considered resistance. She looked seriously at the men and asked how the one could decide her fate, considering he was the useless hero of her life. The rules of the Black House were that all customers were first and foremost guests, and not a hair could fall from their heads, so murders were ruled out in the store. Mei also reminded that the rules are the same for everyone, and that there are no exceptions for the Central Pagoda either. This angered Liao because he felt he was the master of the situation. Not only was he a step above the widow, but he also had the support of the court. A weapon appeared in his hands. It was a ball of light and darkness. It looked like a metal ball with colored inserts with light coming out of it. Black Widow looked at the man questioningly. She tried to understand how the orb had come to be in his possession, for it was the weapon of the head of the center, and there were only two of them. Liao threw the ball, causing it to clatter on the wooden floor of the store. A blue light began to appear from it. It seemed that it would take a moment for the orb to show its true power. A light silhouette of a person appeared from the unusual object. It was a middle-aged man. Chang She and Beiming tensed up. They covered themselves with the fan and waited to see what would happen to the balloon next. After another moment, the silhouette became recognizable. It was now a complete reflection of Zan Chaoli, the head of the Central Pagoda. The man was tall. His facial features were too serious. The scars made it clear that he had been in combat more than once. Beiming looked at the hologram and was shocked. He thought he was looking at the Lord himself. Mei looked at the guy and wondered how he could help her if he didn't even know the head of the Central Pagoda. But her worries were dispelled by the guy himself, pointing out that he knew his son, Jiang Tian. The holographic image of the man looked around at everyone present. He turned to Liao to clarify about the Hong family's wedding celebration and asked if the attendees were here. But he greeted his master and said that he was in a dark house in Luohei district. The supervisor immediately became furious, as he would not allow the balloon to be used before the celebration began. Liao begged the Lord to have mercy on him. He said he had a good reason for disobeying the order. Threatened with dismissal if the version was not credible, Zan Chaoli demanded an explanation. He began his story from the moment he arrived at the gala when he learned that Lan and Li had gone in search of the white jade bone. According to his plan, the Black Widow Pagoda was to send this item as a gift for the Hong family. And deciding to blame Mei for everything, he stated without a shadow of a doubt that she was the one who refused to give them the bone. The girl looked at the reptilian liar. The girl looked at the reptilian liar. The head waved it off and said that since everyone was so eager to get this bone, it would make a great gift. He ordered the widow to immediately hand over the white jade bone to Liao, but the girl was in no hurry to comply with the head's order. She began to explain that the goods had been sold shortly before Liao's arrival, but the head insisted that there was no significance in this, and now she must convince the buyer to return such a valuable item. Mei decided to hit the nerve. She reminded her that doing as her superiors ordered would jeopardize the reputation of the Dark House. This made the head angry, and then he said that since she couldn't follow his orders, she didn't deserve a leadership position. Hiding behind the shadow of his superior, Liao demanded that Mei hurry up since he was afraid of being late for the celebration. The girl's indignation was unbounded, and she sharply replied to the head, reminding him that she was the owner of this dark house. Liao, who was standing and giving the commander a nod, immediately swallowed his tongue at the sharpness of Mei's answer. The girl's heels tapped slowly on the wooden floor, and she approached the ball lying there. The boss gave her a questioning look, to which she only snorted. Liao froze in silence, praying that nothing terrible would happen now that his master could punish him for. Mei swung and kicked the ball with all her might, causing it to shatter. The hologram disappeared as if it never existed. Everyone looked at the girl in silence, not hiding their amazement at such an act. Liao immediately fell to his knees. His mind was replaying further developments from dismissal to assassination. He leaned over the balloon and, seeing its remains surrounded by pathetic debris, screamed that Mei had broken it. He was furious, because now he would not be able to remain innocent. Liao claimed that the girl had betrayed the pagoda. She parried after him and seemed to taste his words, as in fact, pagoda was betraying her interests above all else. The widow wondered what Liao would do if that was really the case. He immediately shouted at the girl, accusing her of madness, because only a madman could afford such a thing. She immediately ordered Liao to leave the dark house, or else he would deal with her. A two-headed bird perched on the railing made an approving sound in support of its mistress. From helplessness, Liao made empty threats, promising the girl that she would regret it. There was less and less time for the man, and he realized this and demanded that Mei give the portal time to recover. Hearing the number 3, Liao commanded his fighters to flee before their fate caught up with them all before their time. Brother Li realized that there was nothing more to catch in the dark house, so he asked Lan to leave immediately. Glowing with a smile, Changsheng turned to the princess, pointing out that her entire army had long since evaporated while she herself was still here. Ignoring the guy's sarcasm, she appealed to the Black Widow to reconsider her decision regarding the white jade bone. But Mei was adamant and insisted that Lan follow Liao's example and leave her store immediately. It was a defeat for the representatives of the Supreme Court, who thought that because of their position, they were allowed everything. Lanya called out to her brother and they hurried away from the dark house, realizing that there was nothing more to catch. The boys looked at each other victoriously, satisfied with the result, because they had come out victorious. Beiming looked at the Black Widow with gratitude. A mute question hung in the air as to what would happen to the Black House next. Mei turned back to the gathered staff. They also wanted to know how fate would deal with them as well. The head of the Dark House wanted to make an announcement. After the incident, the Dark House breaks off all relations with the Central Pagoda and now exists separately. To all those who disagreed, she offered to leave, and to those who stayed, she promised that the store would thrive as long as she lived. After a little thought, she added that if it happened that there was nothing to sell, then the servants should keep an eye on Beiming. The boy was surprised by this decision. He didn't think he was the one who needed to be followed. Mei explained this decision by saying that her trust must be earned in small steps since she had betrayed the center for him. Everyone was surprised when the widow mentioned her heart's trust. This immediately provoked a questioning reaction from the servants who were talking among themselves. They rushed to Beiming and began to praise him, telling him that he had now earned their trust. Changsheng couldn't help but make a friendly joke as well. He said that the young man had done a good job of making Black Widow fall in love with him. But Beiming stubbornly didn't understand what had just happened, but Changsheng reminded him to pay since the guy still needed him. He handed him a black card with words for Gu to take it for himself. There was over 10 million in the account. Changsheng scrutinized the map without seriously believing the boy's words, but Beiming added that he would need the young master to cover him. The surprised and suddenly rich Gu was only interested in how rich Beiming was and how wealthy his family was. Mei intervened in the conversation. She reminded the boy that gossip was unnecessary because it wouldn't change anything. But a world without gossip would be incredibly boring. That's what the young master thought. Beiming reached out to his new friends and invited them to visit in 3 days to show off the surprise. Changsheng and Black Widow were incredibly surprised. They didn't understand what the young man could have prepared in these 3 days. At this moment, one of the salesmen brought out a chest containing Mr. Chen's order. The box had the emblem of the Dark House on it. Beiming took his purchases turned around and headed for the exit, leaving his companion's questions unanswered. The elder who had been watching finally turned to Mei. He wondered how she would get out of this situation. Then the girl told him about her conversation with Beiming on the balcony of the Dark House. The elder was taken aback. He didn't understand how such a young hunter could know about the Celestial Alliance, and assumed that Beiming's appearance was just a trap since they didn't have the strength to fight such a powerful enemy, even to save his brother. Mei was sure there was no trap in all this, and she had no other information about her brother's whereabouts. She turned to the elder and told him that he shouldn't worry because Beiming wouldn't leave her alone, and their real problem was the Jiang family. Beiming walked into his house and commanded his friend, expecting him to rush out to greet him. Gaixian's head appeared near the railing. His eyes were shining, and he couldn't believe his happiness that his friend had returned unharmed. He immediately hurried his friend to get up quickly and visit his sister, who was senseless when he left. Beiming tensed up. He was afraid that something terrible and dangerous might have happened. He immediately ran up to the second floor, entered the bedroom, and sat on the bed where Shuer was lying. The girl lay senseless and seemed to be asleep. Her eyes were closed, and her breathing was even and humble. Gyeoxian was worried about his girlfriend. He still blamed himself for what had happened. All this time, he was only worried about when the girl would come to and what was wrong with her. Baeming calmly explained that she was fine for now. She needed time to regain her strength after her injuries. The friend exhaled with relief. After all, anyone would have tortured himself with anxious answers without knowing what was happening to his comrade. Baeming took another look at his little sister before heading to the kitchen to prepare medicine to make her recovery faster. Gyeoxian stayed with Shuer and assured his brother that he would keep an eye on her so that no one would dare harm her. Coming to the kitchen, Baeming opened the chest brought from the dark house. He was making preparations to create a cure. Looking at the items he had bought, he remembered if he had bought everything to create a drug that would help Shuya recover faster. Among the many recipes known to him, he opted for just two. They were soup and qi yangsheng. Taking a small pot, he filled it with water, putting all the ingredients together and pouring water over them. Then he lit the burner, turned the fire down to low, and put the wok on the hob. Stirring the contents, he recited the recipes aloud over and over again. The last ingredients were to be added and mixed well. After that, it was necessary to simmer the resulting soup to make it thick and brown in color. Looking at the finished soup, the boy pondered that the alchemical furnace wouldn't make him stand at the stove. It would have been easy to remove the poison. A white jade bone caught Baeming's eye, and he still couldn't believe that he had found it in such a small town. Not many people knew the purpose of the item. The head of the Supreme Court was connected to the Celestial Alliance, and that's why he probably wanted it so badly. Looking at the bone, the guy grinned, noting that the friendship of these two forces would not help since he himself had sealed their fates. He took another look at the loot. There was no point in adding it to the soup, for it was incredibly valuable. Then, an unusual idea came into his head. He thought of alchemy, and an unbelievable idea was immediately born in his mind. The next day, the weather in Luan also continued to please its inhabitants. The sunny season did not pass, and thus prolonged the warmth. The friends continued to give Shuya the medicine Baeming had prepared. All they had to do was wait. Hearing the nasty smell, Gyeoxian asked his friend if this brew could really help the girl recover. Baeming got a slight pang of disappointment, but still explained to his friend that the medicine not only cured, but also purified the blood. Gyeoxian was acting like a little kid. The boy kept asking his friend stupid questions. But Baeming assured the guy that such a drug cost several $100,000, and the friend didn't want to drink it. This removed all the doubts of the comrade, and he immediately devoured the plate without noticing the foul smell. He proudly showed his empty plate, proving to Baeming that it was empty. He wanted to hear the praise. Gyeoxian felt better. Baeming took a look at his friend and decided to send him to the dark house to get the alchemical furnace. 3 days had passed, and the weather was still cheering the citizens of Luon. The sun was lingering, and the townspeople no longer appreciated the warm days so much. There was a knock on the door at Chen Baeming's house. It was his new friend, Chang Sheng, who came as promised for the promised surprise. But contrary to Gu's expectations, a little girl came out to him. It was Shui. She was already walking around the house on her own. When she opened the door, she was surprised by the stranger's visit, because he had never come to their house before. Examining the guest in an attempt to find familiar facial features, she still asked who he was. During the dialogue, Chang Sheng chewed on a chicken leg. With his mouth full, he introduced himself and explained that he had a meeting scheduled with Baeming. A familiar shadow flashed behind the door, and the boy's head turned instinctively in its direction. Black Widow appeared in the doorway. The young master took the opportunity to ask how the girl had gotten here. It didn't take him long to figure out when she moved in with Baeming. This was Gu's charming communication pattern. When they heard the joke, the people of the house took it for granted. The jester rejoiced, but Gyeoxian was wary. It was now clear to him why the alchemical furnace from the dark house had gotten their company for free. Mei was getting tired of all this speculation, so she reminded him that Baeming himself had talked about a visit in 3 days. Chang Sheng didn't want to compete in wit anymore, so he asked Shui to call his brother. Then the girl explained that her brother should not be disturbed now, as he was preparing the medicine. He would soon join his friends. The conclusion was self-evident. Baeming was practicing alchemy. The thought shocked his friends. Mei immediately found an explanation for the guy. She figured it was just a cleansing process and immediately pointed out Gu's ignorance. He in turn reminded her of her surprise at the mention of alchemy. Shui grinned. A pleasant smell of herbs wafted through the house. The Black Widow liked the scent and was happy to let herself be bewitched by it. But Gyeoxian shattered her reverie by comparing the smell to the way cooked meat smelled. Shui laughed and explained to her friend that it was just the smell of dragon crystal rice. But Chang Sheng interrupted the girl and decided to give his comment on the matter, saying that it was a dangxiang. Shui and Gyeoxian exchanged questioning glances. They had not heard of such a thing before. The door to Baeming's room was still closed, and it was anyone's guess how long he would be there. Young Mr. Gu thought the guy was doing pretty well, since the smell wasn't as bad as he had heard before. Black Widow thought Baeming was brilliant and powerful. There are few people who could surpass him, and many who would like to follow him. But Mei realized that there were many secrets behind all that power. She had to learn at least a small part of them. The guest's thoughts were interrupted by a strange sound coming from outside. It sounded like the creature making it was approaching the house. Mei heard something too and tensed up. She wished it wasn't the first thing that came to mind. Then the friends saw a ferocious creature with glittering eyes. Smoke flew out of its nostrils, showing the ferocity of the beast. It was a wild royal boar that had come here on the scent, wafting from Beiming's experiments. Sweat appeared on Changsheng's forehead. He didn't expect to see the animal here, as they usually lived hundreds of kilometers away from the city. Black Widow realized that it was the potion that had caused the boar's visit, but she decided at once that she would not interrupt Beiming's preparation of the cure. Changsheng was worried that if the potion was really high quality and useful, its smell could summon even worse monsters. The boar noticed the guests standing nearby and immediately went into decisive action by lunging over him. Changsheng shouted loudly so that everyone present would have time to divert themselves from the impending danger. The boy immediately grabbed your fan and opened it. Now he was ready to meet the unwanted guest. He swung at the boar, hoping that one blow would be enough to defeat it. The ice ball flew towards the boar. Its speed was high, and the animal seemed to have no chance of survival. The weapon hit the target, and the beast howled in pain. But the question remained whether it would be enough to win. Black Widow immediately took the initiative. She swung her whip and struck the boar with all her might. Changsheng cautioned the girl, saying that the animal had a thick hide, and even the strongest weapon would have to fight it. His friend's actions did not stop the boar, but only made it even angrier. Now he was several times more fierce than before. Mei immediately realized that they must find another way out, because joint actions with the guy did not bring any result. Behind the Black Mistress appeared her martial spirit, who was at full strength to attack the offender. But the two-headed bird didn't stop the monster either. He threw it away easily and it fell senseless. Now, Black Widow had to stop the beast from harming her pet. Changsheng rushed to the girl's aid, realizing that she couldn't do it alone. Suddenly, the boar screamed. It was unclear whether the cause was pain or rage. The guests covered their ears, for the sound was so piercing that they could hardly stand it. Changsheng turned around and wondered who had made such a contribution to the boar fight. Gaoxian appeared next to the boy. Apparently, he came running to help the boys when he heard the scary noises. He turned to Master Gu and wryly remarked that fists were much more effective than spells in fighting this kind of monster. He threatened the guests that he would stop protecting them unless they learned to use brute physical force. This really hurt Changsheng. He insultingly recommended that the young hunter learn self-defense. Their argument was interrupted by a growl. It was clear that the animal was not finished. That's when Beiming appeared. He pounced on the boar while commenting on the subject of the boy's argument. Such beasts can only be defeated by knowing their weaknesses. But first, you have to find them. He killed the boar in no time, and it fell with a thunderous crash. Gaoxiong and Changsheng stood astonished and listened attentively to Beiming's story. He didn't expect to hear an adequate answer from them, so he turned to Mei. He asked her how the boar had gotten into their house. The girl referred to a side effect of alchemy. After all, it was the smell that made the animal leave its habitat and come to the guys. But Beiming questioned this theory because he did not believe that Danxiang could have contributed to the problems. The boy tried to remember if he had seen boars in the vicinity of the city before. Mei said that Gu had seen them hundreds of kilometers away from Luone. The girl assumed that they had migrated and were now somewhere nearby. But Beiming didn't believe in such coincidences. It was too suspicious to be true. Changxing proudly said that he would kill the rest of the herd and they would make a great gastronomic delicacy. The boar issue seemed resolved, and now Gu wondered how things were progressing with Beiming's cure. The boy smiled enigmatically. He smiled enigmatically, and it was obvious from his look that he was eager to show the result of his work. He took out a jar and scooped a few blue balls out of it into the palm of his hand. He held them out to his friends, proudly presenting them. They were Xian Beyond pellets. The friends looked at the small balls in surprise, but were in no hurry to take them for themselves. Then the guy himself put the pellets into his friend's palms and boasted that the main ingredient was white jade bone. Now Changsheng understood why the guy had fought so hard for this find. Mei felt a pang of disappointment at having sold that bone for almost nothing. The girl was astonished because even the central pagoda did not produce medicines of such high quality. Changsheng brought the pellet up to his nose and sniffed it from all sides, looking for a questionable odor. When he found nothing suspicious but sweetness, he was delighted because he had never seen such medicines before. He immediately wanted to know about its properties. The main purpose of the pellet was to concentrate the spirit. That's what Beiming claimed. The friends were surprised. It was as if they had not heard that this was possible before. Beiming began to explain that each person has a different spirit, as well as different physical abilities. The medicine was capable of improving body quality and strength in general, which would be necessary in heavy combat. But friends doubted the promised benefits and suggested waiting until Beiming finalized the cure. But even this did not interrupt their admiration, for it was something exceptional that only they had in common. Something unexpected came into the guy's head, and he declared that he would become Beiming's little brother to share useful inventions with him. His great idea was ruined by Mei, reminding him of his family's reputation for not allowing people to be used for profit. But Gu was not timid. He boldly told the girl that he would not meddle in their relationship with Beiming, and she immediately became furious. Chen immediately turned it into a joke to avoid the impending conflict. The friends were having fun talking and teasing each other. They were to make plans for the future together. Suddenly, someone called out Beiming, calling him master. Dongfang Zu stood on the threshold of the Chen family's house. The boy recognized the old man but was surprised to see him because their families had nothing to do with each other anymore. The old man came in peace. He came to say that he would like to forget all past misunderstandings. Dongfang's visit made the boy angry. He remembered how he was banished from their family without ever becoming a part of it. That was why he was the way he was now. There was no point in further conversation. Beiming ordered the old man to go away. Gaoxian, who knew the history of their family's relationship, wanted to support his friend and also pointed out to the old man that he was nothing but a lowlife. But the man was in no hurry to leave. He wanted to tell the important news that the head of the Dongfang family had entrusted to him. At these words, something turned over in Beiming himself, and he decided to listen to his guest. The old man handed the young man an envelope and informed him that Mr. Dongfang would like to see him at his birthday party. When he took the invitation in his hand, the guy was furious. He couldn't believe he'd been disturbed for such a trivial matter. He threw the envelope directly into the Dongfang servant's face, deeming this gesture a worthy response. But the humiliated old man kept insisting that Dongfang wanted to see the entire Chen family at his celebration. Beiming was surprised and re-interrogated the old man for information regarding his parents. After the servant's affirmative answer, the boy still agreed, though he did it without much desire. This conversation was overheard by Shuer. She looked at her brother fearfully, as if waiting for an explanation and defense. Beiming warned the elder that he hoped this invitation wouldn't turn out to be a trap, or else the Dongfangs would pay for it. The elder assured that there was no malice in all this, and that due to Master Chen's celebrity, he was made a welcome guest. Beiming then took his envelope, but his doubts persisted, and he looked at the invitation, still expecting a trick. The old man bowed to the lad and said he would come tomorrow to escort the lad to the feast. Chang Sheng suddenly intervened in the conversation. The boy indignantly said that he also wanted to attend the event. The young Mr. Gu's question put the elder in an awkward position, causing him to hover in an attempt to find the most neutral answer possible. But after considering the guy and realizing who also wanted the invitation, without a doubt agreed. Only the old man exhaled as the Dark Widow addressed him with the same request. Recognizing the girl as the Lord of the Black House, he also allowed her to join the festivities. The old man's mission had been accomplished, and now Beiming reordered the servant to leave his house. No sooner had the guest left than Chang Sheng informed the guy that he was very alarmed by all this. Mei agreed, because if the Dongfangs really wanted reconciliation, they would have waited for Chen's parents to return. But interest was taking over, and the friends were still going to find out what fate had in store for them. For Beiming, this meeting held a special meaning. He didn't want to miss the opportunity to meet the Dongfang leader. The old man went back to his master and reflected on the meeting that had taken place. He was concerned about the boy's acquaintance with Mr. Gu and the Black Widow. The servant rushed to report this as it was meaningful to the entire Dongfang diaspora. Beiming went up to his room and stood in front of the furnace to prepare the immortality pill. In his hands, he held a red envelope with an invitation from the Dongfang family. In the back of his mind, the guy still hadn't figured out how he felt about their head. Beiming had no intention of keeping that envelope, and without a shadow of a doubt, threw it into the furnace fire where it drifted away as if it had never existed. Looking at the burning paper, he wondered what kind of drugs Dongfang Xingqiong was selling. Beiming took out the pill he had prepared and began to examine it. The boy had doubts whether his body could handle such a strong energy. After a second's thought, the young man decided she was not and swallowed the medicine, hoping that the effect of it would not disappoint him. Beiming squeezed his eyes shut and waited for the pill to take effect. It took a while before the guy started to feel something. Suddenly, a painful sensation began to grow in his chest. At some point, the pain became unbearable, and he screamed. Snowball looked fearfully at his master, who, under the influence of the drug, began to emit a light that seemed unfriendly. Strange sounds began to come from the second floor, and the friends looked around. Shuer looked fearfully at Black Widow and asked what was going on with her brother, and if everything was going to be okay. Mei put her palm on the girl's head, smiled and tried to cheer her up, saying that her brother was strong and he was not afraid of anything. Chang Sheng was against the girl joining them and said that her appearance would no doubt attract monsters. Black Widow heard a note of doubt in his words and immediately decided to set the record straight. But their conversation was interrupted by a sudden gust of magical wind that opened the door leading to Beiming's room. The friends didn't understand what had happened. They looked at each other in surprise and ran through the options in their heads. Cheng Sheng's voice told everyone to urgently run upstairs to find out what had happened. He himself flew into the room looking for Beiming. But he stood there, not even going in to see his friend. Shuer, who came running in, was also shocked to see her brother's bedroom. Beiming sat on the floor and emitted an ominous magical light that illuminated the entire room. His face was contorted in pain. Black Widow stopped her friends from coming to help. She knew that in this state he could not be interrupted. Beiming sat motionless in the middle of the room, and only his face was contorted with pain. Mei decided that the young man was trying to refine the Xian Gudan prepared from the white jade bone. Looking at the guy, she knew something was wrong. She also knew that the pill could have dire consequences. A growing ball of light energy began to appear in Beiming's hands. It became clear that the process was about to be completed. The flash of light prevented the friends from coming closer, so they humbly waited for their friend to finish what he had started. The refinement was almost over, and the guy held the orb in his hands. Beiming raised his hands and joined palms together. The finishing touches remained. The young man exhaled quietly, and a faint vapor appeared on his lips. Chongsheng took a step towards his friend. He wanted an explanation. Beiming still didn't open his eyes, and everyone held their breath, waiting to see if the medicine worked or not. Master Gu continued to insist on answering. His eyes were literally leaping with childlike interest. He got the answer from Mei, who seemed to have seen it before. She said it was like Beiming had gotten a body similar to the sacred one. Chongshan had no idea that a medicine could affect his strength so much. Mei suggested that he try the miracle pill, but the boy was wary of the idea. She reminded the guy that he was a young master of a noble bloodline who was afraid while an ordinary mid-level hunter did so. An offended Changsheng commented that the whole thing is reckless, and he thinks it's dangerous to bring his body to such a state. Interest piqued the young master, and he asked Mei if she knew what form the boy would take in the end. But even the Black Widow, who seemed familiar with all this, could not have predicted it. She glared angrily at the curious fellow and suggested that she'd get all the details from Beiming when he woke up. After these words, she left the room, leaving the lad alone with his impatience and curiosity. Another day passed, and the friends saw what changes had happened to Beiming after taking the pill. The guy was glowing with confidence. His eyes glistened, and he straightened up, radiating a frenzied energy. Cheng Sheng, who had been dying of curiosity for 24 hours, saw that the young man had absorbed all the energy and moved to a new level of becoming a supreme hunter. Beiming said that it was a painful process, so more time should be set aside to prepare for the king level. Young Master Gu had found his pill and was about to swallow it and make his leap in development, as the Black Widow's voice interrupted his joyful thoughts. She said that she would personally guard the boy so that he would not be disturbed. This made the young man furious, and he suggested that she experience it herself, and then she could equal Beiming's strength. But the girl boastfully reminded that she had already reached the war level without the magic pill. Now she was waiting to see who could catch up with her. With those words, she pissed the guy off again. Cheng Sheng asked Beiming about his new sacred body. He was interested in all the details. The boy was surprised that his friends thought he had undergone such a transformation. The changes were equal to 1% of the sacred body. Beiming said that by feel his body was eternal or diabolical. That remained to be seen. The guy noted that the transformation also increases the resilience of the entire body, which is incredibly important in combat. The friends were shocked to hear this. It was becoming more and more like a sacred thing that Beiming himself had denied. But the guy dismissed them because he knew that it was impossible to achieve such success with a single ritual. Magic, energy, and power had to come together. Black Widow noted that the pill had been fully utilized, which meant that there could be no talk of further rituals. Beiming thought for a second, for there was indeed logic in the girl's words. A voice called out to Mr. Chen. It was Dongfang's servant who came to escort the boys to the event. His friends gave him an unkind look, showing that he had come at a bad time. Shuer and Gaioxian were to stay at home. Beiming ordered his friend to look after his little sister. He, in turn, gladly accepted the assignment and said there was nothing to worry about. But Shuer began to ask Beiming to take her with him. She rounded her eyes sadly and stared at her brother, hoping for a positive answer. Beiming felt that his sister and his friend had not yet reached sufficient strength for such events, so it would be better for them to stay at home. Shuer hugged her brother. She had no choice but to submit to her brother's will. Beiming turned to his friends and asked if they were ready to hit the road. Changsheng smiled and immediately sneered that the Dongfang family could destroy them. Mei was already in the doorway and seemed long since ready to leave the house. Then friends together went to meet adventures, because no one knew what in reality they can expect at the mysterious celebration. Dongfang Mansion was full of guests on this day. Everyone was talking amongst themselves, and there was nothing sinister behind the noise. Beiming and his friends appeared on the lawn outside the house. They were determined. Changsheng noticed that the Dongfang family was incredibly respected in Luan, since almost all of the city's families came here. Beiming explained it was because they were afraid of losing favor with the hosts. After all, then they would no longer be considered important. Master Gu was surprised that Beiming was defending Dongfang, since he had already severed all relations with them. This caused him to laugh lightly. The questions were childishly naive and had no meaning. Beiming waved his hand and invited the boys to follow him. He seemed to have something to show them. An offended Gu walked behind him. He was offended that he didn't get a proper response to his interest. The guests looked at the guys who were making their way through the crowd. Master Chen was immediately recognized in them. A servant opened the door in front of Beiming and invited the newly arrived guests to enter and enjoy the festivities. Now, everyone seemed to be staring at the boys. They looked at them curiously, surprised to note their presence. Rumors immediately began to fill the clearing where the celebration was taking place. Some thought it was all for marriage, and others that it was all for revenge. Beiming's gaze fell on a familiar figure. He recognized Liao Erjiang, whom he had met in the dark house. He called loudly to his companions to follow him. Master Chen was surprised by his visit. Black Widow was also surprised at this meeting because she thought that Liao should be at the wedding that was to be held in the Hong family. The same question plagued Beiming, and he was determined to find out at any cost. The hall was full of guests. I could hardly make out any useful information in their voices. Walking up to Dongfang, the latter immediately introduced Beiming as his nephew. This surprised those present, all except Liao, who was already sitting at the table and drinking a glass of wine. Beiming took this opportunity to ask Dongfang a question that had been on his mind for a long time. He wanted to know where his parents were. Then the Patriarch said that the man who would arrive later would tell him. For now, he should enjoy the fun. Beiming's friends were tense, for beneath the friendly smile of Dongfang's head was a beastly grin. The boy agreed to wait for the promised guest, since he had come here for him. One of the guests got up from his table and invited Yuan to join them. Dongfang smiled slyly. It was clear that nothing good could be expected from this evening. A servant interrupted his thoughts by asking if they could begin the festivities, but the master waved him away, awaiting the arrival of another guest. The crowd was now left with thoughts of Beiming, and everyone was wondering who the mysterious guest was who had kept Dongfang himself waiting. The guests also understood from Mr. Chen's gaze that this was not just a party, but just an excuse. Changsheng wondered why the more influential families weren't invited. Beiming then explained that the Dongfangs' arrogance doesn't go beyond Luone, so they don't want to sag against more important families. Only Master Gu was more influential than them in the hall. Black Widow noticed this and informed him with a smile. Changsheng asked the girl to stop hurling insults at him, although that was apparently their communication style. Behind Beiming's back, the door opened, and a voice familiar to the point of unpleasantness was heard. Hong Zhentao entered the hall, accompanied by his one-armed nephew and servants carrying gifts for the Dongfang head. He approached the host of the evening, greeted him, and apologized for his lateness. A sudden, unpleasant thought struck Beiming. He couldn't believe that Patriarch Hong could know the whereabouts of his parents. Dongfang accepted the courtesies and apologies made to the latecomers, and said that without him, the celebration would not have started. Hong's gaze fell on Chen Beiming, who sat at the table and stared back at him with a burning gaze. The elder Hong reminded his nephew that it was time to give the gift to his friend. He agreed and made a fuss. With his only surviving hand, he held out a red box decorated with golden corners to the Dongfang head. The birthday boy was embarrassed by the surprise. He had no idea what was behind the door. He noticed that Hong's nephew had only one arm. The man wondered how this could have happened and who had done it. Without a shadow of a doubt, Hong Jr. said it was all the fault of the rabid dog that attacked him. But luckily, he was unharmed and it didn't affect him much. Saying that, he looked at Beiming as if promising with a look that their game wasn't over yet, and he would be able to give a decent answer to his opponent. Beiming smiled slyly in response. After all, he must have known that he was the rabid dog himself. The servant opened the chest. In it was a divine-level weapon that Hong had been given by his master. Now, they wanted to give it to Dongfang. Dongfang was surprised by such a valuable gift from the Hongs, although he realized that such generosity was not unreasonable. There was also a wave of surprise among the guests. After all, everyone came with gifts, but their value was many times less. A surprised Dongfang finally turned to his nephew Hong and said that if he accepted this gift, he might have a problem. But the value of the gift was justified by the fact that soon, the families would interbreed and become one friendly clan. This dispelled any last doubts, and the birthday boy happily accepted such a meaningful surprise. Changsheng immediately criticized the gift that was not shown to anyone because it automatically became a family heirloom. One-armed Hong became furious at these words. He demanded that the young man introduce himself. Black Widow and Beiming experienced a second of awkwardness, which immediately passed when they saw Hong's anger. Dongfang soothed his nephew, while he glared angrily at the table where his friends were sitting. Turning away from his uncle and ignoring his words, he determinedly headed over to the guys to talk. He thought it was necessary to clarify the situation, because otherwise it would seem that he was frightened by the insolent man's words. But young Master Gu knew that the guests already understood the dislike they had for each other. Hong turned to Changsheng and said he would forgive him if he cut off his tongue as an admission of his mistake. The guy waved his fans and playfully asked what the offended one would do if he didn't agree himself. An ominous light began to emanate from his nephew. It seemed that every sound he uttered only added to his boiling. The guy pulled out a dagger and lunged at Changsheng, who had long since been ready to repel his opponent's strike. Hong threatened to rip out his tongue himself. Shouting this, he threw the first punch. Master Gu effortlessly repelled the enemy's attack. To him, such a showdown was like child's play. Hong himself certainly didn't expect such an embarrassment that his formidable punch would fail. Before he could recover from the shock, a fan flew in front of his nose, miraculously not hitting him. Another second, and the enemy flew away from the wave of Chang Sheng's gun a few meters away from the enemy. The one-armed man landed and prepared for another attack. He realized that he had no chance of losing and that he had to win at any cost. Chang Sheng looked at this picture with his inherent childlike directness. The furious Hong was preparing to answer the offender when he was stopped by Uncle Dongfang. Pointing at the grinning guy, he introduced the young Gu master to his nephew. The same doubted his uncle's words, but there was no doubt about the head's arguments. Now Hong was looking for clues to understand how the Chen family managed to befriend a powerful clan like the Gu. Quickly realizing that there was no point in feuding with such a person, Hong approached Chang Sheng and decided to start over with a non-committal conversation, then turned to his uncle, suggesting that the birthday festivities begin. Head Dongfang agreed. After all, the guests had long been exhausted from waiting. He summoned a servant and told him to start immediately. He nodded obediently. Hundreds of different dishes and drinks appeared on the tables. The guests were talking animatedly, discussing the latest news in Luan. Liao walked over to Dongfang to congratulate the head and show him his respect. Chang Sheng studied the locals. From their faces, it was easy to tell who was who. Black Widow joked to Gu that his face was so hidden behind smiles that no one would be able to tell who he was. The girl was happy with her joke, and Chang Shen was offended. He asked once again not to be insulted. A voice came from behind young Master Gu and addressed him. The surprised boy turned around and saw his recent opponent. Behind him stood the Hong's one-armed nephew. He begged forgiveness for his temper and said that anyone in his place would have done the same. Chang Sheng responded to the guy in his usual manner. He said that you can't compare their families because the Hongs gave the birthday boy such an expensive gift. But the young man ignored the acrimony and invited the young master to his table. But Gu himself didn't plan to leave his seat. He once again mocked that he couldn't join because otherwise he would lose his tongue. Hearing this conversation, the uncles tensed up. They didn't seem to expect such a response from a high-ranking guest. The elder Hong was tormented by the question of how Beiming was able to establish a relationship with the Gu family. Senior Dongfang replied to his friend that they were only friends. At least, that's what people said. Junior Hong approached his patrons and asked permission to announce some important news. Dongfang smiled and said that he would tell everything soon. He coughed a little to get the audience's attention, and when the buzz died down, encouraged the guests to listen to what he would announce. Everyone tensed up. It became clear that in addition to the birthday party, the next important details would be revealed. The Hongs themselves held their breath, and there was no doubt in anyone's mind that this news was directly related to them. Dongfang stood up from his desk. The voices finally subsided, and the Patriarch began to speak. He made the decision that his daughter Ching would marry Yinshen Hong. The guy stood up at this moment and smiled his friendliest smile to the audience. It meant that their families were now united and responsible for each other. The crowd immediately became animated. No one understood how this was possible because everyone knew that the girl was engaged to Chen Beiming. Now it's clear why Dongfang invited the guy. It was all just to insult the guy in public. Beiming himself commented on the news saying that their engagement was broken long ago, and the only thing he cares about is the whereabouts of his parents. After a wave of surprise, people began to congratulate the Hong family. After all, it was clear that this marriage was good for them. Liao also couldn't help but congratulate him. He thought it was lucky because the eldest daughter of the Dongfangs had opened up a lot of opportunities. This included improving one's skills, and Ying Xian understood this more than anyone else. The engagement pulled the focus from the birthday party. But for the Hongs, it was good luck too, for now the whole town was talking about it. Dongfang himself was not embarrassed by the coincidence of the two holidays. On the contrary, he laughed at how wonderful everything turned out. Suddenly, the door to the hall opened, and Ziyu, the youngest daughter of the family, appeared on the threshold. She stood in the passageway and loudly denied what had been said. There was no way her father could have expected such a prank. He looked at the girl questioningly while he went over in his head how to fix the situation. The guards immediately rushed towards Ziyu, shouting that she wasn't allowed to be here. But the girl immediately shushed them, ordering them to leave her alone. She moved deeper into the hall until she reached the table where her father was sitting. Dongfang Sr. was incredibly angry at the girl's frivolous behavior. It was unacceptable. But instead of withdrawing, she began to tell the plain truth that her father was forcing her sister to marry such a scoundrel. The tension was rising, and the head couldn't take it anymore. He slammed his fist on the table and ordered his daughter to shut up immediately and not to talk too much in front of the guests. He resented the fact that she dared to express her opinion, especially in such a way, although everyone in the family knew that parental orders were not to be discussed. He looked at the servants and ordered them to grab the girl and get her out of here before she caused more trouble. The guards grabbed the girl's hands and tried to take her away. But Ziyu herself was not going to leave, fighting back her father's thugs with all her might. Her eyes fell on Beiming, who was sitting among the guests. She rushed to him and begged him to stop her sister's wedding. but he immediately besieged the girl and made her realize that she was mistaken and that he would not help the young lady with anything like that because it was not his business. Zu's eyes almost filled with tears at the injustice. She had expected that her ex-fiancé would definitely do something for her sister's happiness. The enraged patriarch approached his daughter and, already shouting, ordered her to leave the celebration immediately. One of the servants approached the annoyed girl, took her under the arm, and tried to lead her away. But emotions overwhelmed Dongfang's daughter, and she decided that she would have the last word while insulting Beiming. A gentle hand touched Ziu's shoulder. She immediately turned around to see who dared to disturb her at this moment. The patriarch saw his second daughter Ching and only managed to say her name. The girl stood silently behind her sister, and in her eyes was pain and sorrow at her father's unjust decision. Beiming saw his ex-fiancée, and something in his chest trembled as if a current ran through him, reminding him of all that bound them together. She calmly ordered the head butler to take his hands off her sister. Her voice was calm and soft. The servant was confused, for earlier the head had ordered the girl to be taken away immediately. He was at a loss as to whom he should obey, and looked questioningly at everyone. Ziu saw her sister and was immediately happy to see her. It seemed that the conflict was over. Dongfang nodded approvingly towards the girl, silently ordering the captive to be released. Ching was satisfied with the answer she received, and smiled softly at her father as a sign. But Ziu didn't want to calm down and tried to convey something important to her sister while saying something incoherent. But the young lady only put her finger to her lips and hissed, as if with this sound she were trying to soothe an agitated guest. Ziu looked questioningly at her sister, as if she sincerely didn't understand her calmness. The girl's father started to speak. He said that Ching had arrived on time and had some news for her. Without listening to the head, the daughter apologized. There was a dead silence, and all the guests froze in anticipation. Dongfang himself was surprised by such a statement from his daughter, who seemed to him to be quiet. The next statement shocked everyone. Ching said that she couldn't marry and be related to the Hongs. Beiming looked at the girl silently and waited for what would happen next. Such a statement surprised him as well as the other guests. The young lady turned her head and crossed her eyes with the boy. Her eyes lit up with a sudden sensation. Beiming, on the other hand, tried not to show his face. He tried his best to keep his composure so that he wouldn't give any reaction. Patriarch Dongfang became angry. This was not the first time his daughter had disobeyed his will. Ching decided to explain her decision by saying that her grandfather had spoken to the Chen family, and there was no point in finding her a new fiancé. She also realized that if this decision was not to her father's liking, she would not be able to stay in the Dongfang house. What happened next was something no one could have imagined. Ching took the blade and pointed it at herself, saying it was her only way out. Without waiting for her father's response, she plunged the dagger into herself without giving anyone time for a chance to save her. Pushing back his glass, Beiming flew up from the table. He could not have expected such a decisive answer from such a gentle and meek girl. Ziu also rushed to her sister in hopes of saving her. After all, everything she had done before was for her good. She ran over to her sister's body, which had fallen to the floor, and began to cry, asking her how she could do such a thing. The patriarch also approached his daughter. He could not believe that such a thing could happen, especially in front of hundreds of people. Tears flowed from Ching's eyes, and she apologized for not being able to obey her father's will. Ziu held her sister's head and only kept repeating like a mantra, asking her sister why she did this. Ching's eyes closed, and there was a loud cry from her younger sister. She blamed Beiming for what had happened, because he was the one who broke their engagement. In addition, she said that Ching was a real angel for the guy, because it was she who helped him by negotiating with the families of the city and covering his debts. Beiming couldn't believe what was happening because he realized that if it wasn't for his ex-fiancée, life would have turned out differently for him and Shuer. Thinking back to her sister Ziyu, said how she was genuinely happy that Beiming had become a hunter. The pain pierced the girl, and she couldn't believe how all the good her sister had done had turned against her. Even Gu realized that now Beiming had made a mistake that seemed impossible to correct. The boy clenched his fists at those words. Deep down, he realized that his inaction had led to such consequences. He feverishly went over the options of how he could save the dying girl, as he suddenly remembered about the white jade bone pill. Beiming walked over to his ex-fiancée and knelt down. He examined the girl and made sure she was still in a dying state. Ziyu regarded this gesture as insolence and immediately demanded an explanation from the young man. But instead of making excuses, he ordered his sister to shut up and give him some time. From a small jar, he took out one of the pills and placed it in the palm of his hand, as if he were demonstrating the medicine to those present. The guy himself scrutinized the pill. He was aware of the risks, but he had no choice. The general tension touched the Hongs as well, and they scrutinized the guy's actions. They had not seen such a pill before, hence the question of what level the pill was. Beiming handed the medicine to the girl, and she swallowed it, making an incomprehensible sound. Patriarch Dongfang resented the guy's actions. He no longer believed that it was possible to help her. Unable to control his anger, he rushed toward Beiming, eager to punish the insolent man for such insolence. No sooner had the patriarch gotten to the would-be assailant than something stopped him. A joyous snowball knocked the gentleman to the ground, preventing him from interrupting his daughter's recovery process. The servants and guards didn't have time to react to what had happened. They wouldn't have been able to keep up with Snowball anyway.